Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here with another collection of stories that'll make you question humanity while you mine diamonds or build your next mega base. Whether you're working on or just need something to keep your brain occupied while your hands stay busy, I've got you covered. Tonight's lineup is a mix of neighbor drama, family chaos, and friendship betrayals. These stories come from people who thought they knew the limits of human audacity, and boy, were they wrong. So grab your pickaxe, cue up that strip mine, and let's dive into some tales that prove reality is stranger than any mod you could download. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that password protection means absolutely nothing to certain people. My neighbor keeps using my Wi-Fi without permission, and I just found out how. I live in a duplex and share a wall with my neighbor Clint. He's always seemed harmless enough, just a typical guy in his 40s who waves when he sees me getting mail, and occasionally borrows my hedge trimmer. About 6 months ago, I noticed my internet was running slower than usual. Not terrible, just enough to be annoying when I'm trying to stream anything or hop on video calls for work. I called my internet provider thinking maybe I needed to upgrade my plan, but they ran some tests and said everything looked normal on their end. The slowdown kept getting worse over the next few weeks. My Netflix would buffer constantly. Online games were lagging, and even loading basic websites felt sluggish. I started wondering if there was something wrong with my router, so I decided to check who was connected to my network. When I logged into my router settings, I expected to see my laptop, my phone, maybe my smart TV. What I didn't expect was to see a device called Clint's iPhone connected to my network. At first, I thought maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe there was another Clint in the area whose phone was somehow picking up my signal. But then I saw Clint's MacBook, Clint's iPad, and something called Clint's gaming setup, all connected to my Wi-Fi. This guy had somehow gotten onto my network and was using it for everything. I immediately changed my password to something more complex, thinking that would solve the problem. 2 days later, all of Clint's devices were back on my network. I changed the password again, this time to something completely random with numbers and special characters. Within a week, he was connected again. This became a frustrating cycle where I'd change my password, enjoy normal internet speeds for a few days, then watch as my connection slowed down and Clint's devices reappeared on my network. I started getting creative with my passwords, using long phrases that only I would know, mixing in random characters, even trying to make them as obscure as possible. Nothing worked. Somehow Clint kept getting back onto my Wi-Fi, and I couldn't figure out how he was doing it. The worst part was that he wasn't just casually browsing the web. Based on the data usage I could see in my router logs, he was streaming movies, downloading large files, and running multiple devices simultaneously. Last month, I was outside working in my garden when I overheard Clint talking to another neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who lives across the street. They were discussing internet providers, and Mrs. Rodriguez was complaining about how expensive her monthly bill had gotten. That's when Clint said something that made my blood boil. He told her she should just use someone else's Wi-Fi like he'd been doing. He said he'd figured out that his neighbor, meaning me, wasn't very good with technology and always used simple passwords. According to Clint, I had a pattern where I'd use variations of the same basic information, and once he figured out the pattern, he could guess any new password I set within a few tries. He bragged about how he'd been getting free internet for months, and how I kept making it easy for him by sticking to predictable password formats. He even laughed about how frustrated I must be getting, changing my password over and over, not realizing that he'd basically cracked my system. The worst part was when he offered to help Mrs. Rodriguez do the same thing to other neighbors in the area. I stood there listening to this conversation, holding my gardening gloves, completely stunned that my neighbor was not only stealing my internet, but was actively encouraging others to do the same thing to people in our neighborhood. He was treating my Wi-Fi like it was some kind of community resource that he'd cleverly gained access to through his superior technical skills. That evening, I decided to test his theory about my password patterns. I looked back at all the passwords I'd used over the past few months, and I had to admit that Clint wasn't entirely wrong. I had been unconsciously following certain patterns, using similar base words or number sequences, just changing them slightly each time. Once I saw the pattern myself, I realized how someone paying attention could potentially figure out my system. But instead of just changing to a completely random password, I decided to have a little fun with the situation. I changed my Wi-Fi password to something that would send Clint a very clear message. The new network name became Clint Stop Stealing My Wi-Fi, and the password was Pay Your Own Internet Bill 2024. I figured if he was going to keep guessing my passwords, he might as well see exactly how I felt about his freeloading. Within 2 days, Clint was back on my network. Apparently, even when I made my feelings completely obvious, he still had the nerve to crack my password and continue using my internet. At that point, I realized this wasn't just about him being cheap or opportunistic. This was about him feeling entitled to something that didn't belong to him and having no shame about taking it. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of just changing passwords, I started documenting everything. I took screenshots of my router logs, showing his devices connected to my network. I recorded the dates and times when his usage was highest, and I even took photos of my internet speed tests showing how much slower my connection was when he was using it. Then I printed out all of this documentation, put it in an envelope, and left it on Clint's doorstep with a note explaining that I knew exactly what he'd been doing and that I expected him to stop immediately. I gave him 1 week to find his own internet solution before I'd start looking into other options to resolve the situation. The next morning, I found the envelope sitting on my own doorstep. Clint had returned it without opening it, and there was a handwritten note attached that said, "Your Wi-Fi signal reaches my house, so technically it's fair game. Maybe you should learn how to secure your network properly." I couldn't believe the level of entitlement in that response. Not only was he admitting to stealing my internet, but he was somehow trying to make it my fault for not being better at keeping him out. It was like someone breaking into your house and then blaming you for not having better locks. That's when I decided to contact my internet provider and ask about more serious security options. The technician who came out was amazed when I explained the situation. He said he'd never heard of someone being so persistent about stealing a neighbour's Wi-Fi, especially after being directly confronted about it. He helped me set up enterprise-level security on my home network, the kind of thing that would be nearly impossible for someone like Clint to crack without professional hacking tools. We also changed my network name to something generic, so Clint wouldn't be able to identify which network was mine, just by looking at available connections. For about 3 weeks, my internet ran perfectly. No slowdowns, no unauthorized devices, just the fast, reliable connection I was paying for. I thought the problem was finally solved and that Clint had either given up or gotten his own internet service. Then last week, I was taking out my trash when I saw a van from a different internet company installing service at Clint's house. I figured he'd finally done the right thing and gotten his own connection, but I was wrong. That afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox from Clint. The note said that since I'd made it impossible for him to use my Wi-Fi, he'd been forced to get his own internet service, and he thought I should pay half of his monthly bill, since this was all my fault. He included a copy of his first internet bill and a request for me to send him a check for half the amount. The sheer audacity of asking me to pay for his internet service after months of him stealing mine was beyond anything I could have imagined. He genuinely seemed to believe that I owed him compensation for making him stop stealing from me. I kept that note because I honestly couldn't believe someone would put that level of entitlement in writing. It's been sitting on my kitchen counter for a week now, and every time I look at it, I'm amazed all over again by the logic Clint used to convince himself that I was somehow the villain in this situation. That story's over. The mental gymnastics required to steal someone's internet for months and then demand they pay for your new service is truly Olympic-level delusion. Some people really will find a way to make themselves the victim in any situation, no matter how clearly they're in the wrong. Speaking of people who take things that don't belong to them, our next story involves someone who thought sharing DNA meant sharing everything else, My sister took my prom dress without asking and wore it first. I'm 17 and my sister Naomi is 19. We've always had a complicated relationship, but this incident really showed me just how little she respects my boundaries. I'd been saving up for months to buy the perfect prom dress. I worked extra shifts at my part-time job at the local coffee shop, sold some of my old electronics, and even asked my parents if I could do extra chores around the house for money. Prom was something I'd been looking forward to since freshman year. I'm not usually the type to get excited about formal events, but there was something about prom that felt special and important to me. Maybe it was because I'd finally found a date I was excited about, or maybe it was just the idea of having one perfect night before graduation stress took over completely. After weeks of online shopping and trying on dresses at different stores, I finally found the one. It was this deep blue dress with subtle sparkles that caught the light when I moved. It wasn't the most expensive dress in the store, but it was perfect for me. The colour matched my eyes, the fit was flattering, and when I put it on, I felt confident and beautiful in a way I rarely experienced. I brought it home and hung it carefully in my closet, making sure it was positioned so it wouldn't get wrinkled or damaged. I even bought a special garment bag to protect it and scheduled an appointment to get it professionally steamed the week before prom. Every time I looked at it hanging there, I got excited about the night ahead. Prom was still 2 weeks away when Naomi mentioned that her friend was having a fancy birthday party. Apparently, it was going to be a really upscale event at some trendy venue downtown, and everyone was expected to dress formally. Naomi had been complaining for days that she didn't have anything appropriate to wear and couldn't afford to buy something new. I felt bad for her situation, but I also didn't think it was my problem to solve. Naomi has always been impulsive with money, spending her paycheck on things like expensive makeup and clothes she wears once, then panicking when she needs something important. I've learned not to enable that behaviour by constantly bailing her out of financial situations she creates for herself. The night before her friend's party, Naomi asked if she could borrow something from my closet. I told her she was welcome to look through my regular clothes, but that my prom dress was off limits. I explained that I didn't want to risk anything happening to it before my own event, and that it meant too much to me to lend out. Naomi seemed to understand, or at least she didn't argue about it. She spent some time going through my other clothes and ended up choosing a black dress I'd worn to a cousin's wedding the year before. It wasn't as fancy as what she probably wanted, but it was appropriate for the occasion and looked good on her. The next evening, while Naomi was getting ready for the party, I was at work. I had picked up an extra shift to earn a little more money for prom accessories, so I didn't get home until almost midnight. When I walked past Naomi's room, her door was closed and the lights were off, so I assumed she was already asleep. The next morning, I woke up early to get ready for a study session with friends. I went to my closet to grab a sweater and immediately noticed that something was wrong. My prom dress was no longer in the garment bag where I'd carefully stored it. Instead, it was hanging loosely on a regular hanger, and the fabric looked slightly wrinkled. I pulled the dress out to examine it more closely and found several small stains on the bodice that hadn't been there before. There was also a small tear in the delicate fabric near the hem, and the dress smelled like perfume and cigarette smoke. My perfect, pristine prom dress had clearly been worn to a party and returned to my closet damaged. I marched straight to Naomi's room and knocked on her door until she answered. When I confronted her about the dress, she didn't even try to deny what she'd done. She said the black dress I'd offered her wasn't fancy enough for the party, so she'd decided to borrow my prom dress instead. She claimed she'd been careful with it, and that the damage was minimal. When I pointed out the stains and the tear, Naomi shrugged and said those things could probably be fixed. She suggested I take it to a dry cleaner and see if they could remove the stains, and maybe a tailor could repair the torn fabric. She said it like these were minor inconveniences rather than serious damage to something that was incredibly important to me. I was furious, but what made it worse was Naomi's attitude about the whole thing. She acted like I was being over-dramatic for being upset. She kept saying it was just a dress and that she was sure it could be fixed good as new, She couldn't seem to understand why I was so angry about her taking something I'd explicitly told her not to touch. The worst part was when she started justifying her actions by saying we're sisters and sisters should share everything. She said I was being selfish for not wanting to help her out when she needed something nice to wear. According to her logic, my refusing to lend her the dress in the first place was what had forced her to take it without permission. I spent that entire day calling dry cleaners and tailors, trying to find someone who could fix the damage before prom. The first 3 places I called said the stains were too set in to remove completely, and that the tear was in a location that would be difficult to repair invisibly. One woman at a specialty dress shop agreed to look at it, but warned me that even with professional cleaning and alterations, the dress might never look exactly the same. When I told Naomi about the repair estimates, she seemed genuinely surprised by how expensive they were. The dry cleaning alone was going to cost more than $60, and the alterations would be another $40. She said she didn't realize fixing the damage would cost so much, but she also didn't offer to pay for any of the repairs. Instead, she suggested that maybe I was making too big a deal out of the whole situation. She said the dress still looked fine to her, and that probably no one at prom would notice the small imperfections. She even offered to let me borrow something from her closet for prom, as if that would somehow make up for ruining my dress. I ended up taking the dress to the specialty shop, and while they did an amazing job with the repairs, the dress was never quite the same. The stains were mostly gone, but you could still see faint marks if you knew where to look. The tear was expertly mended, but the fabric had a slightly different texture in that spot. More than the physical damage, though, was the emotional impact of what Naomi had done. Every time I looked at the dress after that, I thought about how she'd taken something that was special to me and treated it carelessly. The dress that was supposed to make me feel beautiful and confident now reminded me of my sister's disrespect and selfishness. Prom ended up being a wonderful night, despite everything. My date was sweet, my friends looked amazing, and we had a great time dancing and taking pictures. But there was always this underlying sadness, knowing that my perfect dress had been tarnished by someone who should have been supporting me and respecting my boundaries. The relationship between Naomi and me has never really recovered from this incident. It wasn't just about the dress. It was about what her actions revealed about how she sees me and my belongings. She demonstrated that her immediate wants were more important to her than my feelings or the things I care about. That story is over. There's something particularly heartbreaking about having a special moment tainted by someone who should be celebrating with you instead of stealing from you. The casual dismissal of the damage just adds insult to injury. Now let's talk about what happens when someone decides your vacation plans sound like their vacation plans. My friend invited themselves on my vacation and then expected me to pay for everything. I'm 25 and I work as a graphic designer at a marketing agency. After a particularly stressful few months dealing with difficult clients and tight deadlines, I decided I needed a solo vacation to recharge. I'd been dreaming about taking a trip to Costa Rica for years, and I finally had enough saved up to make it happen. I spent weeks researching the perfect itinerary. I wanted to do some hiking in the cloud forests, visit the wildlife reserves, maybe take a surfing lesson on the Pacific coast. The whole point was to have time alone to decompress, read books on the beach and not have to worry about anyone else's schedule or preferences for once in my life. I was excited about the trip and started talking about it with friends and co-workers. I showed them pictures of the eco-lodge I'd booked, shared articles about the national parks I planned to visit, and talked about how much I was looking forward to disconnecting from everything for a week. Everyone seemed genuinely happy for me and supportive of my solo adventure plans. My friend Theo, who I've known since college, was particularly interested in hearing about my travel plans. He kept asking detailed questions about where exactly I was staying, what activities I had booked, how much everything was costing. I thought he was just being a good friend, showing interest in something I was excited about. About 3 weeks before my departure date, Theo and I were having coffee when he casually mentioned that he'd been thinking about taking a vacation too. He said work had been stressing him out and that he needed to get away somewhere tropical. I agreed that he deserved a break and suggested he start looking into some options for later in the year. That's when Theo said something that completely blindsided me. He said, "Actually, your Costa Rica trip sounds perfect. I'll just come with you." Not, "Would you mind if I joined you?" Or, "Do you think I could tag along?" Just a statement that he would be coming on my carefully planned solo vacation. I was so surprised that I didn't respond right away, and Theo took my silence as agreement. He immediately started talking about how great it would be to travel together, how we could split costs on accommodations, and how much fun we'd have exploring Costa Rica as a team. He even pulled out his phone and started looking at flights while we were still sitting at the coffee shop. I tried to explain that I'd specifically planned this as a solo trip because I needed some alone time to recharge. I told him that I'd already booked everything for one person and that changing the reservations might be complicated or expensive. Theo brushed off my concerns and said we could figure out the logistics later. Over the next few days, Theo kept bringing up the trip in our text conversations. He'd send me links to activities he wanted to add to our itinerary, restaurants he thought we should try, and photos of gear he was planning to buy for the adventure. He was acting like we'd mutually agreed to travel together, even though I'd never actually said yes to his participation. I realised I needed to be more direct about my intentions, so I called Theo and explained again that this was meant to be a solo trip. I told him I appreciated his enthusiasm, but that I really needed this time alone and had been looking forward to the solitude. I suggested he plan his own trip to Costa Rica later in the year and offered to share all my research to help him organise it. Theo seemed hurt by my response. He said he thought we were close enough friends that I'd want to share this experience with him. He pointed out that we'd travelled together before and had always had a good time. He made me feel like I was being selfish for not wanting to include him in something that sounded fun and exciting. Despite feeling guilty, I stood firm on my decision. I told Theo that this wasn't about our friendship or whether I enjoyed travelling with him. It was about me needing some solo time to process everything that had been happening in my life. I thought the conversation had resolved the issue and that Theo understood my position. 2 weeks before my trip, I got a text from Theo with a screenshot of his flight confirmation. He'd booked the exact same flights I was taking, arriving in Costa Rica the same day I was and departing the same day I was. The message said, "Surprise, I decided to book the trip anyway. We can figure out the details when we get there." I called him immediately and asked what he was thinking. He said he'd decided that even if we couldn't stay at the same place, we could still explore the country together and meet up for activities. He'd booked his flights without consulting me and seemed to expect that I'd be happy about his surprise. When I expressed frustration about his decision to insert himself into my solo vacation, Theo got defensive. He said I was being dramatic and that having a friend along would make the trip more fun and safer. He couldn't understand why I was upset about having company on what he saw as just a regular vacation. The situation got worse when Theo started asking about specific logistics. He wanted to know if he could stay at the same eco-lodge I'd booked, whether we could share a rental car, and if I could help him plan activities since I'd already done all the research. It became clear that he expected me to essentially be his travel coordinator for a trip he'd invited himself on. When I told him he'd need to make his own accommodations and transportation arrangements, Theo seemed genuinely surprised. He said he'd assumed we'd be travelling together since we were going to the same place at the same time. He started talking about how much more expensive everything would be if he had to book separately. That's when the real issue became apparent. Theo had booked his flights but hadn't actually budgeted for the full cost of the trip. He'd seen my vacation as an opportunity to travel somewhere expensive while splitting costs with someone who'd already done all the planning work. He wasn't just inviting himself along for the company. He was expecting me to subsidize his vacation. He asked if he could share my rental car and split the cost, stay in my lodge room if there was space, and join the tours I'd already booked and paid for. When I explained that most of my reservations were for single occupancy and couldn't easily be changed, He suggested I call the places and see if we could upgrade to accommodate both of us. The final straw came when Theo said he was counting on sharing costs with me because he couldn't afford the trip otherwise. He'd essentially gambled that I'd let him tag along and help cover his expenses, and now he was trying to make me feel responsible for his financial situation. I told Theo that I wasn't going to change any of my reservations, that he'd need to make his own travel arrangements, and that while I'd be happy to meet up for a meal or activity if our paths crossed, this was still my solo vacation. He accused me of being a bad friend and said he couldn't believe I'd leave him stranded in a foreign country. The irony was that he'd stranded himself by booking flights to a destination where he'd made no other arrangements and couldn't afford to stay independently. I hadn't invited him, hadn't encouraged him to come, and had explicitly told him this was meant to be a solo trip. In the end, Theo did make it to Costa Rica, though he spent most of the trip at a budget hostel near the airport because he couldn't afford the places I'd booked in the national park areas. We met up for dinner one night, and he spent the entire meal complaining about how expensive everything was and how much better his trip would have been if I'd been willing to share accommodations. My solo vacation ended up being exactly what I needed, despite the stress Theo had added to the planning process. I got to hike through the cloud forests at my own pace, spend quiet mornings reading by the ocean, and have the space to think through some important decisions I'd been avoiding. It reminded me why I'd wanted to travel alone in the first place. That story is over. The mental gymnastics of inviting yourself on someone's solo trip and then expecting them to cover your costs is truly something else. Some people really think friendship means unlimited access to your plans and wallet. Our next story comes from someone who thought family dinners were supposed to be about food, not commentary. My cousin keeps making jokes about my weight at family dinners and says she's just teasing. I'm 23 and I've struggled with my weight my entire life. It's something I'm working on with therapy and lifestyle changes, but it's been a long journey with lots of ups and downs. Family gatherings have always been challenging for me because there's so much focus on food, and I often feel self-conscious about what I'm eating and how much. My cousin Rosa is 28 and has always been naturally thin. She's one of those people who can eat whatever she wants without gaining weight, and she's never really understood what it's like to have a complicated relationship with food. We grew up in a family where commenting on people's appearance was pretty normal, but Rosa has always taken it further than everyone else. The comments started when we were teenagers, but they've gotten worse as we've gotten older. At first it was things like asking if I was really going to eat a second helping or suggesting I try the salad instead of whatever I'd chosen. I learned to brush off these comments because Rosa claimed she was trying to be helpful. As adults, the comments have become more pointed and frequent. Every family dinner, Rosa finds a way to make some remark about my weight, my food choices, or my appearance. She'll say things like, "Oh, you're really going for the pasta today, huh?" Or, "I guess someone's not worried about swimsuit season." She always says these things with a laugh, like they're light-hearted observations rather than hurtful jabs. The worst part is that Rosa makes these comments in front of the entire family. At my grandmother's birthday dinner last month, she announced loudly, "Well, we know who's going to clean their plate tonight," while looking directly at me. Everyone heard it, and the table got awkwardly quiet for a moment before someone changed the subject. When I've tried to address Rosa's behaviour, she always responds the same way. She says she's just teasing and that I'm being too sensitive. She claims that family should be able to joke around with each other and that I shouldn't take everything so seriously. She acts like I'm the problem for being hurt by her comments, rather than acknowledging that her words are inappropriate. Rosa also likes to frame her comments as concern for my health. She'll say things like, "I'm just worried about you," or "I want you to be around for a long time." But her tone and timing make it clear that these aren't genuine expressions of concern. They're judgmental observations disguised as caring statements. The comments have started affecting how I feel about family gatherings. I used to look forward to holidays and birthday celebrations, but now I spend the days leading up to these events feeling anxious about what Rosa might say. I find myself planning what I'll eat in advance, not based on what sounds good, but based on what might generate the fewest comments from her. Last Christmas, I decided to try a different approach. When Rosa made a comment about my food choices, I calmly asked her to stop making remarks about what I was eating. I explained that her comments made me uncomfortable and that I'd appreciate it if she'd keep her observations about my appearance to herself. Rosa's response was to laugh and say, "Oh, come on, don't be so dramatic. It's just family teasing." She looked around the table for support and said, "Right, guys." We all joke around with each other. A few family members nodded uncomfortably, but no one really spoke up to either support me or call out Rosa's behaviour. After that dinner, Rosa actually escalated her comments. It was like my request for her to stop had challenged her somehow, and she needed to prove that she could say whatever she wanted. At the next family gathering, she made more comments than usual, and they were more pointed and personal. She started bringing up my weight in conversations that had nothing to do with food or appearance. When someone mentioned a hiking trip they'd taken, Rosa said, "Oh, that sounds like it would be hard for some people." When my aunt talked about shopping for a new dress, Rosa said, "It's so much easier when you can shop in regular sizes." The situation reached a breaking point. At my cousin's wedding last spring, during the reception, Rosa came up to me at the dessert table and said loudly, "Should you really be having cake? I mean, you look great in that dress, but..." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Several other guests overheard the comment, and I felt humiliated. I left the reception early that night and cried in my car for 20 minutes before driving home. It wasn't just about Rosa's comment, it was about the cumulative effect of years of these little digs and the way they'd started to shape how I felt about myself and my place in the family. I decided I needed to have a serious conversation with Rosa, not in front of other family members, but privately, where we could really address what was happening. I called her a few days after the wedding and asked if we could meet for coffee to talk about something important. When I explained how her comments had been affecting me, Rosa seemed genuinely surprised. She said she had no idea that her teasing bothered me so much, and that she thought we had the kind of relationship where we could joke about anything. She claimed that she made comments about everyone, and that I was singling her out unfairly. I tried to explain that there's a difference between occasional light-hearted jokes and consistently targeting someone's insecurities. I told her that comments about weight and appearance are particularly sensitive topics for many people, and that her remarks had been affecting my mental health and my enjoyment of family events. Rosa listened to what I had to say, but I could tell she didn't really understand why I was making such a big deal out of what she saw as harmless family banter. She said she'd try to be more careful about her comments, but she also said she hoped I could work on being less sensitive about teasing. For a few months after our conversation, Rosa did tone down her comments somewhat. She still made occasional remarks, but they were less frequent and less pointed than they had been. I thought maybe we'd reach some kind of understanding and that family dinners might become more comfortable for me. But gradually, Rosa slipped back into her old patterns. The comments started creeping back in, first as subtle observations, then as more obvious jokes. By Thanksgiving, she was back to her usual behaviour, making remarks about my food choices and appearance like our conversation had never happened. At this point, I'm considering whether I want to continue attending family gatherings, where I know I'll have to deal with Rosa's comments. It's because I love seeing makes me my extended family, and I don't want to miss out on important celebrations. But the stress and humiliation of dealing with Rosa's behaviour is starting to outweigh the positive aspects of these events. My therapist has suggested that I might need to set firmer boundaries with Rosa, even if that means being more confrontational than feels comfortable. She's also recommended that I talk to other family members about the situation and ask for their support in addressing Rosa's behaviour. The hardest part is that Rosa genuinely doesn't seem to understand why her comments are hurtful. In her mind, she's just being playful and family-oriented, and I'm the one who's overreacting. But impact matters more than intent, and the impact of her words has been to make me dread family gatherings and feel self-conscious about my appearance. That story is over. Family members who weaponize just teasing are some of the most exhausting people to deal with. The fact that she actually escalated after being asked to stop shows this was never about playful banter. Let's move on to something that'll make you want to buy your own toothbrush in bulk. My roommate used my toothbrush and put it back wet. I'm 26 and I've been living with my roommate Elias for about 8 months now. We found each other through a roommate matching app, and overall things have been pretty decent. He pays his bills on time, keeps common areas relatively clean, and we generally stay out of each other's way since we work different schedules. The bathroom situation in our apartment is a little weird because we only have one full bathroom that we have to share. We've worked out a pretty good system where I use it in the mornings before work, and he uses it in the evenings after he gets home from his night shift job. It's not ideal, but it works most of the time. About 2 months ago, I started noticing that my toothbrush was wet when I went to use it in the morning. Not just damp from humidity, but actually wet like someone had just used it. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things, or that I'd used it the night before and forgotten, but it kept happening, and I'm pretty obsessive about my oral hygiene routine, so I knew I wasn't leaving it wet. I have a pretty distinctive toothbrush. It's electric, bright blue, and definitely not something you'd confuse with a regular manual toothbrush. I keep it in a charging stand on the counter, so it's clearly visible and obviously belongs to someone specific. There's no way Elias could have mistaken it for his own toothbrush, which is a basic red manual one that he keeps in the medicine cabinet. The wet toothbrush thing kept happening maybe 3 or 4 times a week. I'd wake up, stumble into the bathroom, and find my toothbrush sitting in its charger, with water still dripping from the bristles. It was gross and confusing, but I kept telling myself there had to be some logical explanation that didn't involve my roommate using my personal hygiene items. I started paying more attention to the bathroom after Elias used it in the evenings. I'd check my toothbrush before bed and make note of whether it was dry. Then I'd check it again in the morning and document whether it was wet. The pattern was pretty clear. My toothbrush was always dry when I went to bed and frequently wet when I woke up. One morning, I found not just my toothbrush wet, but also my tube of toothpaste sitting on the counter with the cap off and a small amount of paste still clinging to the opening. That's when I knew for certain that someone was using my stuff. I'd left the toothpaste in the medicine cabinet the night before, and now it was out on the counter like someone had used it and forgotten to put it back. I decided to test my theory by setting up a small experiment. I placed a piece of tape over my toothbrush charger in a way that would be disturbed if someone moved the toothbrush. I also put a tiny dot of nail polish on the handle in a spot where someone wouldn't notice it unless they were looking for it, but where it would show if the brush had been handled while wet. The next morning the tape was broken and there was a smudge in the nail polish where wet fingers had obviously gripped the handle. My toothbrush was soaking wet and there were still water droplets in the charger base. Someone had definitely been using my toothbrush, and that someone had to be Elias since he was the only other person with access to the bathroom. I spent the whole day at work feeling disgusted and trying to figure out how to address the situation. Using someone else's toothbrush is such a violation of basic hygiene and personal boundaries. It's not like borrowing a book or using someone's pen. It's putting something that's been in your mouth into someone else's mouth, which is incredibly gross and potentially unhealthy. That evening, when Elias got home from work, I asked him directly if he'd been using my toothbrush. I tried to keep my tone calm and non-accusatory, thinking maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe his toothbrush had broken and he'd been meaning to buy a new one. Maybe there was some emergency I didn't know about. Elias didn't even try to deny it. He just shrugged and said, "Yeah, sometimes. Mine's kind of old and doesn't work as well as yours." He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like borrowing my toothbrush was equivalent to borrowing a towel or a hair tie. He seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset. I explained that using someone else's toothbrush without permission was unsanitary and inappropriate. I told him that toothbrushes are personal items that shouldn't be shared, and that if he needed a new one, I'd be happy to pick one up for him the next time I was at the store. I thought this would resolve the issue quickly and easily, but Elias got defensive about my reaction. He said he always rinsed it off afterward and that he didn't see what the big deal was. He pointed out that we'd shared food and drinks before, so sharing a toothbrush shouldn't be any different. He acted like I was being unreasonable for having boundaries about my personal hygiene items. I tried to explain the difference between occasionally sharing a drink and regularly using someone's toothbrush without asking. I mentioned the health risks, the basic courtesy of asking before using someone's personal items, and how uncomfortable it made me feel knowing my toothbrush had been in someone else's mouth. Elias listened but didn't seem to really understand why I was making such a big deal out of it. He promised he'd stop using my toothbrush, but also made it clear he thought I was overreacting. He said he'd buy his own electric toothbrush when he had time to go shopping, which could be a few days since his work schedule was pretty hectic. I offered again to pick one up for him, but he said he preferred to choose his own. The next morning, my toothbrush was wet again, and the morning after that, Elias had apparently decided that his promise to stop didn't need to take effect until he got around to buying his own replacement. I was furious that he'd continue using my toothbrush after we'd specifically talked about how inappropriate it was. I bought Elias an electric toothbrush that afternoon and left it on the bathroom counter with a note saying he no longer had any reason to use mine. I thought this would definitely solve the problem, since he'd said the issue was that his old toothbrush wasn't as good as my electric one. But even after I provided him with his own electric toothbrush, mine continued to be wet some mornings. When I confronted Elias about it again, he said he sometimes forgot which toothbrush was which, especially when he was tired after work. He suggested I keep my toothbrush in my room if I was so concerned about it. The idea that I should have to hide my toothbrush in my bedroom to prevent my roommate from using it was absurd. This was a shared bathroom, and I should be able to keep my personal hygiene items there without worrying about someone else putting them in their mouth. I told Elias that the solution wasn't for me to hide my belongings, but for him to respect basic boundaries. I ended up buying a small locking cabinet that I mounted on the bathroom wall. Every night, I'd put my toothbrush inside the cabinet and lock it. Every morning, I'd unlock it and take out my toothbrush to use. It was ridiculous that I had to go to these lengths to protect my personal hygiene items from my own roommate, but it was the only way I could be sure Elias wasn't using my toothbrush. Elias thought the locking cabinet was overkill and made jokes about how paranoid I was being. He'd make comments about how I was treating my toothbrush like it was made of gold, or how I must not trust him at all, but he never acknowledged that his behaviour was what had made the cabinet necessary in the first place. The whole situation made me realise that Elias and I had very different ideas about personal boundaries and respect for other people's belongings. If he was willing to use my toothbrush repeatedly after I'd asked him to stop, what other personal items might he be using without asking? I started keeping more of my things in my room and became generally more cautious about what I left in shared spaces. Our lease is up in a few months, and I've already started looking for a new living situation. The toothbrush incident might seem small, but it revealed something fundamental about Elias's character and his respect for other people's boundaries. I don't want to live with someone who thinks my personal hygiene items are fair game whenever he feels like using them. That story's over. The mental image of finding your toothbrush wet every morning is absolutely revolting. Some boundaries should be so obvious they don't need explaining, but apparently basic hygiene isn't one of them. The fact that he continued even after getting his own toothbrush shows this was never about convenience. Speaking of people who think your property is their property, let's talk about what happens when neighbours take landscaping into their own hands. My neighbour trimmed my tree without telling me. I'm 31, and I've been living in my current house for about 5 years. It's a modest place in a quiet residential neighbourhood where most people keep to themselves, but are generally friendly when you run into them at the mailbox or while walking dogs. I have a beautiful oak tree in my front yard that's probably been there for decades. It's one of the main reasons I fell in love with the house when I was shopping around. The tree provides great shade in the summer, turns gorgeous colours in the fall, and gives the whole property a mature, established feel that you can't get with newly planted landscaping. The tree does hang slightly over my neighbour Mara's property line. Maybe 3 or 4 feet of the branches extend over her yard, which is pretty normal for mature trees in older neighbourhoods. The branches don't touch her house, don't interfere with her driveway, and don't block any windows. They just provide some natural shade over a corner of her backyard. Mara moved in about 2 years ago and seemed nice enough when we first met. She's probably in her 50s, recently divorced, and mentioned that she was looking forward to having her own space where she could make decisions without having to consult anyone. I thought it was sweet that she was excited about home ownership and independence. Over the past year, Mara has made several comments about my tree. She'd mention how many leaves fell in her yard during autumn, or how she wished she got more direct sunlight on her vegetable garden. I always offered to help clean up any leaves that blew over from my tree, and I explained that the shade was actually protecting her lawn from getting burned during the hottest parts of summer. Last month, Mara started dropping hints that she thought the tree should be trimmed back. She'd say things like, "It's getting so overgrown," or "These old trees can be dangerous in storms." I took her concerns seriously and had a certified arborist come look at the tree. He said it was no signs of disease or structural problems, healthy and well maintained. That would make it a safety hazard. I shared the arborist's report with Mara, thinking it would reassure her about the tree's condition. She seemed disappointed by the professional assessment that the tree was fine as it was. She started mentioning the city ordinances about trees that hang over property lines, though she never actually looked up what those ordinances said. 2 weeks ago, I left for a long weekend to visit my sister in another state. When I came home Sunday evening, I immediately noticed that something looked different about my front yard. It took me a moment to realise what had changed, but then I saw it. Half of my beautiful oak tree was gone. Someone had cut off every branch that extended over Mara's property line, and they'd cut them back several feet further than necessary. The tree now had this weird lopsided shape, where one entire side had been hacked off. It looked like something had taken a giant bite out of it, leaving jagged cuts and a completely unnatural silhouette. I walked around to get a better view of the damage and realised just how extensive the cutting had been. They hadn't just trimmed the branches that hung over the property line, they'd cut back branches that were entirely on my property, apparently to make sure nothing would grow back over Mara's yard anytime soon. The tree looked butchered. There were piles of branches and sawdust all over both yards, and I could see where a ladder had left marks in the grass. This wasn't the work of a professional tree service. The cuts were rough and uneven, made with what looked like a chainsaw, wielded by someone who didn't know what they were doing. Some of the remaining branches had been damaged by falling debris. I knocked on Mara's door immediately. When she answered, she had this guilty expression on her face, like she knew exactly why I was there. I asked her directly if she'd had my tree trimmed while I was away. She didn't deny it, but she also didn't exactly admit it. She said she'd taken care of the overhang situation and that she hoped I didn't mind. When I explained that she'd had no right to cut branches on my tree without permission, Mara got defensive. She said the branches were hanging over her property, so she had every right to trim them. She claimed she'd looked up the city ordinances and found that property owners are allowed to cut any branches that cross their property line. I told her that even if she had the legal right to trim branches on her side of the property line, which I wasn't sure about, she'd clearly cut branches that were entirely on my property. She'd also damaged the tree's structure and appearance in a way that would take years to recover from, if it ever did. Mara said she'd hired someone who claimed to know what they were doing and that she'd told them to be careful not to damage the tree. She showed me a business card for a guy who apparently advertises tree trimming services on Craigslist. When I called the number, it went straight to voicemail, and the guy never called me back. I had my arborist come back to assess the damage. He was horrified by what he saw. He explained that the way the branches had been cut could lead to disease, pest infestation, and structural problems for the tree. The uneven weight distribution might cause the tree to become unstable in high winds. He said there was a real possibility that the tree might not survive this kind of traumatic pruning. The arborist estimated that it would cost several $1,000s to properly correct the damage, and even then, the tree would never look the same. He recommended removing several more branches to balance the weight distribution, which would make the tree even smaller and less attractive than it already was after Mara's butcher job. When I presented Mara with the arborist's assessment and the repair estimate, she seemed surprised by how expensive it was going to be. She said she'd thought tree trimming was no big deal and that branches grew back quickly. She offered to pay for half the repair costs, as if the damage to my property was somehow a shared responsibility. I explained that this wasn't a shared responsibility situation. She'd hired someone to cut my tree without my permission, and now she needed to pay for the full cost of repairing the damage. Mara balked at the total amount and said she couldn't afford to pay that much for what she still saw as minor trimming. The situation has been ongoing for 2 weeks now, and my beautiful oak tree continues to look butchered and lopsided. Every time I pull into my driveway, I'm reminded of how someone I thought was a reasonable neighbour took it upon herself to permanently alter my property while I was away. I've contacted my homeowner's insurance to see if they'll cover the damage, but they've said this type of situation usually falls under neighbour disputes rather than covered damages. I'm considering small claims court to recover the costs of repairing the tree, but the legal process could take months while the tree continues to deteriorate. The worst part is that Mara still doesn't seem to understand why I'm upset. She keeps saying she was just trying to solve a problem and that trees grow back anyway. She can't grasp that she's permanently damaged something that took decades to grow, and that meant a lot to me aesthetically and emotionally. Our neighbour relationship is obviously ruined now. We don't speak when we see each other outside, and there's this constant tension whenever we're both in our yards at the same time. What used to be a peaceful neighbourhood environment now feels hostile and uncomfortable. That story is over. Taking a chainsaw to someone's decades-old tree while they're out of town is such a violation of basic property rights. The fact that she hired some random guy from Craigslist instead of a professional makes it even worse. Some people really think being neighbours gives them editing rights to your landscaping. Let's move on to a story about someone who learned that friendship has different definitions for different people. My friend borrowed my shoes and got them ruined in the rain. I'm 24 and I work at a law firm downtown where appearance matters a lot. I've invested in a few really nice pieces for my work wardrobe, including a pair of expensive leather dress shoes that I saved up for months to buy. They're classic black Oxfords that go with everything and make me feel professional and put together. My friend Jonah and I have known each other since college, and we've always been pretty casual about borrowing each other's stuff. T-shirts, books, phone chargers, the usual things friends share without thinking twice about it. We're similar sizes in most things, so it's never been an issue when one of us needed to borrow something temporary. About 3 weeks ago, Jonah was getting ready for a job interview at a financial services company. He'd landed this interview after months of applications and networking, and he was really nervous about making a good impression. He'd bought a new suit for the occasion, but when he was getting dressed the morning of the interview, he realised his dress shoes were falling apart. Jonah called me in a panic around 7 in the morning, explaining that the sole of his dress shoe had completely separated and was flapping around when he walked. He'd tried to glue it back together, but it wasn't holding, and he didn't have time to go buy new shoes before his interview. He asked if he could borrow my dress shoes since we wore the same size. I was still half asleep when he called, but I could hear how stressed he was about the situation. This interview was really important to him, and he'd been unemployed for several months. I told him he could borrow the shoes, but I emphasised how much they'd cost and asked him to be really careful with them. He promised he'd treat them like they were made of gold. Jonah picked up the shoes that morning and headed off to his interview. I wished him luck and told him to text me afterward to let me know how it went. I felt good about helping out a friend in a stressful situation, especially when it was something as important as a job interview. The interview apparently went well, and Jonah was optimistic about his chances of getting the position. He texted me that afternoon to thank me for lending him the shoes and said he'd drop them off the next day after work. I was relieved that everything had worked out and that I'd been able to help him present himself professionally. The next evening, Jonah showed up at my apartment with my shoes, but instead of the pristine leather dress shoes I'd lent him, he was carrying two muddy, water-stained disasters. The leather was completely soaked through, covered in mud and what looked like sidewalk salt. The shoes were so wet that water was literally dripping from them onto my doormat. I stared at the ruined shoes in shock. These weren't just a little scuffed or dirty, they were completely destroyed. The leather was already starting to crack from being soaked. The colour had changed from black to a weird brownish grey, and they smelled like wet dog. There was no way these shoes would ever look professional again, even with extensive cleaning and conditioning. When I asked Jonah what had happened, he seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. He explained that it had rained unexpectedly during the day, and he'd had to walk several blocks to his car after the interview. He said he'd tried to avoid puddles, but the rain was coming down pretty hard, and there wasn't much he could do to keep the shoes dry. I pointed out that the shoes weren't just wet from rain. They were covered in mud and grime that suggested he'd walked through some pretty rough terrain. Jonah admitted that he'd also used the shoes to run some errands after the interview, including walking through a construction area where there was a lot of dirt and gravel. What made the situation worse was Jonah's attitude about the damage. He kept saying things like, "They'll dry out," and "leather is supposed to get wet sometimes." He seemed to think that once the shoes dried, they'd go back to looking the way they had before. He had no understanding of how water damage affects expensive leather goods. When I explained that the shoes were probably ruined and would need to be replaced, Jonah looked genuinely shocked. He said he'd assumed that since they were just shoes, they could handle a little water and mud. He pointed out that he'd worn them carefully during the interview itself, and that the damage had happened afterward due to circumstances beyond his control. I tried to explain that expensive leather dress shoes require special care and aren't meant to be worn in heavy rain or through construction sites. I showed him the care instructions that had come with the shoes, which specifically warned against exposure to excessive moisture. Jonah seemed surprised that shoes could have such specific care requirements. When I mentioned that the shoes had cost me almost $300, Jonah's attitude shifted from dismissive to defensive. He said he'd had no idea they were that expensive, and that I should have warned him about how delicate they were. He acted like the damage was partially my fault for not providing detailed care instructions when I lent them to him. I reminded Jonah that I'd specifically asked him to be careful with the shoes, and that I'd mentioned they were expensive when he borrowed them. I also pointed out that basic care for leather shoes, like avoiding prolonged exposure to water and mud, should be common sense for anyone wearing dress shoes to a professional interview. Jonah offered to pay for cleaning the shoes, but when I explained that they were beyond cleaning and would need to be replaced entirely, he balked at the cost. He said he couldn't afford to replace $300 shoes, especially since he was still unemployed. He suggested I file a claim with my renter's insurance or see if a cobbler could repair them. I took the shoes to a professional shoe repair shop to get a second opinion on whether they could be salvaged. The cobbler took one look at them and shook his head. He explained that the water damage had gone all the way through the leather, and that the salt and chemicals from the sidewalks had caused permanent staining and cracking. He said attempting to restore them would cost almost as much as buying new shoes, and still wouldn't return them to their original condition. When I shared the cobbler's assessment with Jonah, he seemed frustrated that the damage was as extensive as I'd claimed. He suggested that maybe I was being too picky about the condition of the shoes, and that they might still be wearable, even if they didn't look perfect. He didn't seem to understand that dress shoes for a professional environment need to actually look professional. The situation has created tension between us that's affected our entire friendship. Jonah seems to think I'm being unreasonable about material possessions, while I feel like he was careless with something valuable that belonged to me. We've barely spoken since the shoe incident, and when we do interact, there's this underlying resentment on on both sides. I ended up having to buy new dress shoes for work, which meant another few months of saving up money I hadn't planned to spend. Every time I wear the new shoes, I think about how this situation could have been avoided if Jonah had either been more careful or taken responsibility for the damage he caused. The whole experience has made me much more cautious about lending personal items to friends. I've realised that not everyone has the same understanding of what it means to borrow something valuable, and that some people genuinely don't understand the difference between casual items and things that require special care. That story is over. Returning someone's $300 shoes looking like they went through a swamp and saying, "They'll dry," is friendship malpractice. The fact that he took them through a construction site after the interview shows he never understood what he was borrowing in the first place. Time for a story about someone who thought romantic relationships came with memory exemptions. My partner forgot our anniversary 2 years in a row. I'm 29, and I've been with Clara for almost 4 years now. She's smart, funny, and we generally have a great relationship. But she has this weird blind spot when it comes to dates and anniversaries that's starting to really get to me. When we first started dating, Clara made it clear that she wasn't big on traditional romantic gestures. She said she thought Valentine's Day was commercialised nonsense, and that she'd rather show affection through actions than through obligatory flower deliveries. I actually appreciated that perspective, because it felt more genuine than performing romance on schedule. But there's a difference between not making a big production out of anniversaries and completely forgetting they exist. Our first anniversary came and went without Clara even mentioning it. I'd been looking forward to acknowledging the milestone, maybe going out for a nice dinner, or just spending intentional time together, reflecting on our first year as a couple. I waited all day for Clara to say something, anything, that would indicate she remembered what day it was. Nothing. We had a perfectly normal Tuesday where she complained about work, we ordered takeout and watched Netflix before going to bed. It was like any other random day of the year. The next morning I brought up that we'd missed our anniversary. Clara seemed genuinely surprised and said she had no idea it had been the day before. She apologised and said she was terrible with dates, but that the relationship itself was what mattered, not arbitrary calendar markers. She suggested we celebrate that weekend instead. We did end up going out for a nice dinner that Saturday, and Clara was sweet about acknowledging the milestone belatedly. She talked about how happy she'd been over the past year, and how much she looked forward to our future together. It felt genuine and romantic, even if the timing was off. I figured the first anniversary slip was just an honest mistake. Clara really is terrible with dates in general. She forgets birthdays, misses appointments, and has to set multiple phone alarms to remember basically any scheduled event. Her forgetting our anniversary seemed consistent with her overall relationship to time and dates. But then our second anniversary rolled around, and the exact same thing happened. I spent the entire day waiting for Clara to acknowledge the date, dropping subtle hints about what a special day it was, even mentioning that we'd been together for exactly 2 years. Clara responded to my hints with confusion, like she couldn't figure out why I was being so sentimental about a random Wednesday. This time, when I brought up that she'd forgotten our anniversary again, Clara got defensive. She said she didn't understand why I was so fixated on dates when our relationship was strong and loving every day of the year. She accused me of caring more about performative romance than about the actual substance of what we had together. Clara also pointed out that she shows love through actions rather than calendar awareness. She mentioned all the ways she takes care of me throughout the year, like bringing me coffee when I'm stressed, listening to me complain about work, and supporting me through difficult family situations. She said these ongoing demonstrations of love were more meaningful than remembering to mark arbitrary dates. I tried to explain that it wasn't about performative romance or arbitrary dates. Our anniversary represents the beginning of something important to me, and acknowledging it feels like honouring the choice we made to build a life together. It's not about flowers or expensive dinners, it's about pausing to appreciate what we've created. Clara listened to my explanation, but I could tell she didn't really understand why the date itself mattered to me. In her mind, every day we choose to stay together is an anniversary of sorts. She couldn't grasp why the specific date we became official deserved special recognition when our relationship is celebrated through daily actions and choices. What bothered me most was that Clara remembered other dates that were important to her. She never forgot when her favourite band was releasing a new album or when tickets went on sale for concerts she wanted to attend. She remembered her friends' birthdays and her work deadlines. She just couldn't seem to prioritise remembering dates that were important to our relationship. I started to feel like maybe I was being unreasonable about the whole thing. Maybe Clara was right that focusing on the relationship itself was more important than marking calendar dates. Maybe I was putting too much significance on something that was ultimately just a number on a calendar. But then I talked to my sister about the situation, and she pointed out something I hadn't considered. She said that forgetting someone's birthday or anniversary isn't really about being bad with dates. It's about not prioritizing something that's important to the other person. If Clara could remember concert dates and work deadlines, she could remember our anniversary if it truly mattered to her. That perspective made me realize that this wasn't just about Clara's relationship with time and dates. It was about what she chose to make space for in her mental calendar. She remembered things that were important to her, but she didn't seem to think our anniversary was worth the mental energy required to remember it. I decided to try a different approach for our third anniversary. Instead of hoping Clara would remember on her own, I started mentioning it weeks in advance. I'd casually bring up that our anniversary was coming up, maybe suggest restaurant options, or mention that I was looking forward to celebrating another year together. Clara would respond positively to these mentions, saying she was looking forward to celebrating too, but I could tell the date itself wasn't sticking in her memory. She'd engage with the conversation about celebrating our relationship, but she wasn't actually retaining the specific date when that celebration was supposed to happen. 2 weeks before our third anniversary, I put it in Clara's phone calendar with an alert. I figured if she genuinely struggled with remembering dates, a digital reminder would solve the problem. The alert was set to go off the morning of our anniversary, with a message about our special day. The morning of our third anniversary, I woke up excited to see how Clara would respond to the calendar reminder. I was hoping she'd mention it over coffee, or suggest plans for celebrating that evening. But when Clara's phone buzzed with the alert, she just dismissed it without reading the message. She was focused on getting ready for work and didn't take the time to see what the notification was about. That evening, I waited again for Clara to say something about the anniversary. The calendar reminder had clearly failed to capture her attention, and we were back to the same pattern of me hoping she'd remember something she'd already proven she wouldn't prioritise. When I brought up that we'd missed our third anniversary, Clara seemed frustrated that we were having the same conversation again. She said she didn't understand why I kept setting myself up for disappointment when she'd already explained that dates weren't important to her. She suggested that maybe I needed to accept this aspect of who she was instead of trying to change it. But it's not about changing who Clara is. It's about her making an effort to acknowledge something that's important to me, even if it's not naturally important to her. Relationships require compromise and consideration for each other's needs, not just acceptance of incompatible differences. I love Clara, but this pattern has made me feel like my emotional needs aren't worth the minimal effort it would take for her to set a phone reminder or write a note to herself. It's not about grand romantic gestures or expensive celebrations. It's about her caring enough to remember something that matters to me. That story is over. 3 years of completely blanking on anniversaries while remembering concert ticket sales shows this isn't about being bad with dates. When someone consistently forgets what matters to you, they're showing you where you rank in their priorities, and that message comes through loud and clear. Moving on to a story about family members who think your kitchen is a free-for-all buffet. My brother eats all the leftovers before anyone else gets them. I'm 25 and still living at home while I save up for a house down payment. It's not ideal, but it's allowed me to put away a decent amount of money each month, and my parents have been supportive of my plan to move out once I have enough saved. The living situation works pretty well for the most part. I pay rent to my parents, help with household expenses, and try to be a good roommate rather than treating the place like I'm still a teenager. We've established boundaries about shared spaces, guest policies, and general courtesy that make cohabitation manageable for everyone involved. The one area where we've struggled to find balance is food, specifically leftovers. My brother Samir is 27 and also still living at home, though his situation is more about convenience than financial necessity. He makes decent money, but enjoys the benefits of home-cooked meals and minimal living expenses. Samir has this habit of eating leftovers that were clearly intended for other people, not just taking a portion of leftover pizza or pasta, but literally finishing entire containers of food that other family members were obviously planning to eat later. He'll come home from work or wake up in the middle of the night and systematically clear out the refrigerator. The first time I really noticed this pattern was when I'd made a large batch of chicken and rice for meal prep. I'd portioned it into containers for my lunches throughout the week, labelled them with my name, and stacked them neatly in the fridge. By Wednesday morning, all 5 containers were gone. When I asked Samir about it, he said he'd been hungry after his late shift and hadn't realised the food was specifically designated for my work lunches. I explained that when food is portioned into individual containers and labelled with someone's name, it's pretty clear that it's not meant to be shared freely. Samir apologised and said he'd be more careful about checking labels before eating leftovers. I thought the issue was resolved and that he just needed the boundary clarified, but the pattern continued. Leftover birthday cake that my mum had specifically saved for dessert the next day would disappear overnight. Soup that my dad had made for his lunches would be gone by morning. Pizza that we'd ordered for a family movie night would vanish before anyone else got seconds, let alone leftovers for the next day. Samir seemed to operate on the principle that any food in the refrigerator was fair game once everyone had gone to bed. He'd conduct these midnight raids where he'd eat not just one leftover, but multiple different items until he'd basically cleared out anything that looked appealing. It was like living with a food hurricane that struck between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. What made it more frustrating was that Samir would eat leftovers even when there were plenty of other food options available. We'd have a fully stocked pantry, fresh ingredients for cooking, and his own groceries that he'd bought for himself. But instead of making something or eating his own food, he'd go for the leftovers that other people were counting on. My parents tried to address the issue by establishing clearer rules about shared food versus personal food. We implemented a labelling system where anything with someone's name on it was off limits to everyone else. We designated specific shelves in the refrigerator for communal leftovers versus individual portions. We even tried keeping a whiteboard on the fridge where people could write notes about food they were saving. None of these systems worked because Samir would either ignore the labels, claim he hadn't seen them, or argue that the food had been sitting there too long and was probably going to go bad anyway. He seemed to have an excuse for every instance of leftover theft, and he'd present these excuses like they were reasonable justifications for taking food that belonged to other people. The situation reached a breaking point when Samir ate the entire container of soup that my mum had made for my dad's lunch the next day. My dad had specifically requested that soup because he'd been feeling under the weather, and my mum had spent extra time making it with ingredients she thought would help him feel better. When my dad went to pack his lunch and found the empty container, he was genuinely hurt. Samir's response to this incident was to say he didn't know the soup was specifically for Dad's lunch, and that if it was that important, someone should have put a note on it. But there had been a note written in my mum's handwriting that said, "For your lunch tomorrow, feel better." Samir claimed he hadn't seen the note, even though it was taped directly to the lid of the container. I started keeping my leftover food in a mini fridge in my room because I got tired of planning meals around food that might not be there when I needed it. It felt ridiculous to have to hide food in my bedroom like I was protecting it from a roommate who couldn't respect basic boundaries. But it was the only way I could guarantee that my meal prep wouldn't disappear overnight. My parents were frustrated by the ongoing food situation, but they seemed reluctant to impose serious consequences on Samir. They'd have conversations with him about being more considerate, but when the behaviour continued, they'd just sigh and buy more groceries instead of addressing the underlying problem. The dynamic started affecting family meals and food planning. My mum would make extra portions of everything because she knew Samir would probably eat more than his share. My dad started eating his leftovers immediately after dinner, instead of saving them for lunch because he couldn't count on them being there the next day. I stopped suggesting family meal plans because I knew any leftovers would become Samir's late-night snacks. Last month, my mum made a special dessert for my birthday dinner. She'd spent the afternoon making this elaborate trifle with layers of cake, pudding and fruit that she knew I loved. After dinner, she carefully covered it and put it in the refrigerator so we could have it again the next day with my extended family who was coming over. The next morning, the entire trifle was gone. Not just a slice or two, but the whole thing. Samir had apparently decided it made a good midnight snack and had eaten the entire dessert that was meant to last through the next day's celebration. When my mum discovered the empty dish, she actually started crying, not just because of the food, but because of how thoughtless and selfish the behaviour was. When I confronted Samir about eating my birthday dessert, he said he hadn't realised there were plans to serve it again the next day. But even if that were true, eating an entire large dessert that clearly took significant time and effort to make showed a level of selfishness that went beyond just being inconsiderate about leftovers. The birthday dessert incident finally prompted my parents to have a serious conversation with Samir about his food behaviour. They told him that his pattern of eating other people's food was affecting the whole family's ability to plan meals and enjoy leftovers. They established a new rule that any food in the refrigerator was off limits to him, unless he had explicit permission from whoever made it. Samir agreed to the new rule, but within a week he was back to his old patterns. He'd eat leftovers and then claim he forgot about the rule, or argue that the food looked like it was going to go bad, or say he thought it was communal food because it wasn't labelled clearly enough. It became clear that he wasn't going to change his behaviour voluntarily. I'm planning to move out in the next few months, and honestly, the leftover situation has become one of my main motivations for accelerating that timeline. I'm tired of having to protect my food like it's valuable property, and I'm frustrated by living in a household where one person's lack of consideration affects everyone else's daily life. The whole situation has made me realise that some people genuinely don't understand the concept of delayed gratification or consideration for others when it comes to immediate desires. Samir sees food he wants and eats it, regardless of who made it, who it was intended for, or what plans other people might have had for it. That story is over. Living with someone who treats the family fridge like their personal all-night buffet is exhausting. The fact that he ate an entire birthday trifle shows this goes way beyond absent-mindedness into pure selfishness territory. Some people really can't see past their own immediate cravings. Let's dive into a story about relatives who think party invitations come with zero obligations. My aunt showed up to my birthday party with no gift and took leftovers. I turned 28 last month and decided to throw myself a birthday party for the first time in years. Usually I just do small dinners with close friends, but this year I wanted to celebrate with extended family and have a proper party with decorations, games, and a home-cooked feast. I spent weeks planning the whole event. I sent out invitations 3 weeks in advance, planned a menu that would accommodate everyone's dietary restrictions, bought decorations, and even made a 3-layer chocolate cake from scratch because store-bought never tastes quite right to me. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and I was genuinely excited about bringing everyone together. My Aunt Juliet responded to the invitation saying she'd love to come and asking if she could bring anything. I told her just to bring herself, and that I had everything covered. She seemed excited about the party and mentioned how nice it would be to see family members she hadn't connected with in a while. The day of the party arrived, and I spent the morning cooking and setting everything up. I'd made enough food to feed an army: roasted chicken, 3 different side dishes, salad, bread rolls, and of course the birthday cake I'd spent hours decorating. Everything looked perfect, and I felt proud of the celebration I'd organised. Guests started arriving around noon, and everyone brought thoughtful gifts. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just small tokens that showed they'd put some thought into celebrating my birthday. Books from people who knew I loved reading, a nice bottle of wine, some fancy tea, a plant for my garden. It felt good to be celebrated by people I cared about. Juliet arrived about an hour into the party, empty-handed. Not just without a gift, but without even a card or flowers from the grocery store. She walked in like it was completely normal to show up to someone's birthday party without bringing anything at all. When other guests were putting their gifts on the designated table, Juliet just bypassed that area entirely. I tried not to let it bother me, because the party wasn't really about receiving gifts. It was about spending time with family and friends, and I was happy Juliet had come to celebrate with everyone. Maybe she was going through financial difficulties, or maybe she'd forgotten something at home and would mention it later. Juliet seemed to enjoy herself during the party. She mingled with other guests, complimented the food, and participated in the games I'd organised. She took lots of photos and seemed genuinely happy to be there. I was glad she was having a good time and felt like the gift situation was probably just an oversight. When it came time to cut the cake, Juliet was right there with everyone else, singing happy birthday and taking pictures. She accepted a generous slice of cake and complimented my baking skills. She asked for the recipe and said she'd love to try making it herself sometime. It was a nice moment, and I felt good about sharing something I'd made with someone who appreciated it. As the party wound down and guests started to leave, people began helping me clean up and pack away leftover food. This is where things got weird with Juliet. Instead of helping with cleanup or saying goodbye, she started loading leftovers into containers she'd apparently brought with her. Not just a small portion of cake or a container of one dish, but substantial amounts of multiple different foods. She filled one container with chicken, another with side dishes, grabbed several bread rolls, and cut herself another large piece of cake to take home. She was systematically packing up enough food to last her several meals. I watched this happening and wasn't sure how to respond. On one hand, I had made a lot of food and there were definitely going to be leftovers. On the other hand, Juliet was taking enough food to feed a small family, while other guests who had brought gifts were politely declining my offers to take leftovers home. What bothered me most was the presumptuous way Juliet was helping herself to the food. She didn't ask if she could take leftovers or wait for me to offer them. She just started packing up food like she was entitled to take whatever she wanted from the party I'd hosted and paid for entirely myself. When I gently mentioned that she was taking quite a lot of food, Juliet said she didn't want it to go to waste. She pointed out that I lived alone and probably wouldn't be able to eat all the leftovers before they spoiled. She acted like she was doing me a favour by taking the food off my hands. But I hadn't been planning to let the food go to waste. I'd been looking forward to having leftovers for the next few days, so I wouldn't have to cook after spending so much time and energy on the party. I'd also been planning to send some food home with my elderly neighbour who had helped me set up decorations earlier that day. The other guests started to notice what Juliet was doing, and the atmosphere became a bit uncomfortable. Here was someone who hadn't brought a gift or contributed anything to the party, but was taking more leftovers than anyone else. It created this weird dynamic where people didn't know whether they should also start taking food or just ignore what was happening. I ended up having to be more direct with Juliet about the leftover situation. I told her I appreciated that she didn't want food to go to waste, but that I had plans for the leftovers and needed her to leave some for other guests and for myself. She seemed surprised by my response and said she hadn't realised I wanted to keep the food. Juliet did put back some of the containers she'd packed, but she kept a substantial amount of food and seemed annoyed that I'd asked her to moderate her takeaway. She made comments about how much food there was and how it would probably go bad anyway if people didn't take it home. After Juliet left, several other guests commented on her behaviour. They'd noticed that she hadn't brought a gift, but had taken more leftovers than anyone else, and they thought it was inappropriate. One of my cousins said she'd been embarrassed by Juliet's presumptuous attitude about the food. The whole situation left me feeling weird about a party that had otherwise been really lovely. Instead of feeling celebrated and happy about the successful event I'd organised, I felt taken advantage of by someone who had treated my birthday party like a free meal opportunity. What bothered me wasn't necessarily that Juliet hadn't brought a gift. People have different financial situations, and I understand that not everyone can afford to buy presents. What bothered me was the combination of not contributing anything to the celebration while taking more than her share of what I'd provided. A few days later, Juliet texted me to thank me for the party and mentioned how much she'd enjoyed the leftovers I'd shared with her. She asked when I was planning to host another family gathering because she'd love to come to the next one. The message made it clear that she viewed my parties as opportunities for free food rather than celebrations she wanted to contribute to. I haven't responded to Juliet's text because I'm not sure how to address the situation without creating family drama. But I'm definitely going to think twice before inviting her to future celebrations, especially ones where I'm doing all the work and covering all the expenses myself. That story is over. Showing up gift-free and leaving with bags of food is the kind of behaviour that gets you uninvited from future gatherings. The fact that she came prepared with containers shows this was premeditated freeloading, not a spontaneous decision to help with leftovers. Next up, we have someone who discovered that some friends can't let anyone else have a moment. My friend always one-ups every story I tell. I'm 26 and I've been friends with Hugo for about 3 years. We met at a networking event for young professionals, and initially, I really enjoyed his company. He seemed worldly, accomplished, and had interesting stories about his travels and career experiences. Over time, though, I started noticing a pattern in our conversations that was becoming increasingly frustrating. Every time I'd share an experience or tell a story about something that had happened to me, Hugo would immediately jump in with a similar but more dramatic version featuring himself as the protagonist. It started with small things that seemed harmless enough. I'd mention having a stressful day at work, and Hugo would launch into a story about how his job was even more demanding. I'd talk about a restaurant I'd enjoyed, and Hugo would describe an even better restaurant he'd discovered. At first, I thought he was just being conversational and trying to relate to my experiences, but the pattern became more obvious and more extreme over time. I couldn't finish a sentence about anything I'd done, seen or experienced without Hugo immediately redirecting the conversation to his own adventures. It was like he couldn't bear to let me have a moment of being interesting or having done something noteworthy. Last month I told Hugo about a weekend trip I'd taken to a nearby national park. I'd gone hiking alone, seen some beautiful waterfalls, and had this really peaceful experience connecting with nature. I was excited to share the photos and talk about how refreshing it had been to disconnect from city life for a few days. Before I could even finish describing the hiking trail I'd taken, Hugo interrupted to tell me about his recent backpacking trip through Patagonia. He spent the next 20 minutes detailing his multi-week adventure, complete with stories about dangerous river crossings, encounters with wild animals, and breathtaking vistas that made my little weekend hike sound like a walk in the park. The thing is, Hugo's stories always seem designed to make my experiences look small or mundane by comparison. It's not just that he has different adventures to share, it's that he consistently presents his stories in a way that diminishes whatever I've just told him about. He can't just say, "That sounds great, I love hiking too." He has to describe something so much more extreme that my story becomes irrelevant. This pattern extends beyond travel stories. When I mentioned getting a promotion at work, Hugo immediately started talking about the job offer he'd just received that came with a higher salary and better benefits than my new position. When I shared that I'd started taking pottery classes, Hugo told me about the sculpture course he was taking that was much more challenging and artistic. What makes it worse is that Hugo presents these one-ups as if he's being supportive and relating to my experiences. He'll say things like, "I know exactly what you mean," before launching into a story that's completely different from and much more impressive than whatever I just shared. He seems to think he's being a good friend by sharing his own experiences, but the timing and presentation make it clear that he's competing rather than connecting. I started paying attention to whether Hugo ever asked follow-up questions about my stories or showed genuine interest in my experiences. The answer was almost never. He'd listen just long enough to identify what category my story fell into, then immediately launch into his superior version. He wasn't really listening to understand or connect. He was listening to find an opening to talk about himself. The most frustrating incident happened when I was telling Hugo about a scary experience I'd had when my car broke down on a remote highway late at night. I'd been genuinely frightened, had to wait hours for a tow truck, and felt vulnerable being stranded alone in an unfamiliar area. It was one of those experiences that stays with you because of how helpless and anxious it made you feel. Hugo let me get about halfway through the story before interrupting to tell me about the time his motorcycle broke down in the middle of nowhere in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. According to his version, he'd had to spend the night sleeping rough, had been approached by suspicious locals, and had to use survival skills to make it through until help arrived. Not only did Hugo's story completely overshadow my relatively minor car trouble, but he told it with this tone that suggested my experience wasn't really worth worrying about. He made comments like, "At least you were in your own country and a few hours isn't really that long to wait." He managed to simultaneously top my story and minimize my feelings about what had been a genuinely stressful experience for me. I realized that I'd started censoring myself around Hugo, avoiding sharing experiences that I thought might trigger one of his competitive responses. I'd catch myself thinking, if I tell Hugo about this, he'll just tell me about something bigger he did, and then I'd change the subject or keep the story to myself. That's when I understood that Hugo's constant one-upping was actually damaging our friendship. I no longer felt comfortable sharing things that mattered to me because I knew they'd be dismissed or overshadowed by his supposedly superior experiences. Conversations with him had become performance opportunities for him rather than genuine exchanges between friends. I decided to try addressing the pattern directly by calling it out in the moment. The next time Hugo started to one-up something I'd shared, I said, I was actually hoping to finish telling you about my experience before we moved on to talking about yours." Hugo seemed genuinely surprised by my comment and said he was just trying to relate to what I was sharing. I explained that while I appreciated him wanting to connect over similar experiences, the timing and way he shared his stories made it feel like he was competing with me rather than supporting me. I asked if he could try listening to my whole story and asking questions about it before sharing his own related experiences. Hugo said he understood and would try to be more aware of the pattern, but within the same conversation, he did it again. I told him about a book I'd really enjoyed, and before I could explain what I'd liked about it, he was telling me about a better book by the same author that I probably hadn't read yet. It was clear that this behaviour was so ingrained that he wasn't even conscious of doing it. Over the next few weeks, I noticed that Hugo made some effort to catch himself, but the improvements were minimal and inconsistent. He'd sometimes stop mid-sentence when he realised he was one-upping me, but other times, he'd fall right back into the same pattern. It became clear that changing this behaviour would require more sustained effort than he was willing or able to invest. The friendship has gradually become less important to me as I've realised that Hugo isn't really interested in my experiences or perspectives. He's interested in using my stories as launching points for his own narratives. Every conversation Feels like a competition where he's trying to prove that he's more interesting, more accomplished, or more adventurous than I am. I still see Hugo occasionally at group events, but I've stopped trying to have meaningful one-on-one conversations with him. When he asks what I've been up to, I give brief, generic answers that don't provide openings for him to launch into his superior stories. It's sad to lose a friendship, but I got tired of feeling like a supporting character in every conversation. The experience has made me more aware of this dynamic in other relationships and more intentional about being a good listener when friends share their experiences with me. I've learned that true friendship involves celebrating each other's stories rather than competing with them, and that the best response to someone sharing something meaningful is usually curiosity and enthusiasm rather than a bigger story of your own. That story is over. Some people are so desperate to be the most interesting person in the room that they turn every conversation into a competition. True friends celebrate your stories instead of immediately trying to top them with their own supposed adventures. Now let's talk about neighbours who think your comfort is negotiable when it comes to their security. My neighbour put up a bright security light that shines into my bedroom. I'm 31 and I live in a quiet residential neighbourhood where most people are considerate about how their property maintenance affects their neighbours. I've been in my house for about 4 years, and until recently, I had a good relationship with everyone on my street. My neighbour Leah moved in next door about 6 months ago. She's a single woman in her 40s who mentioned during our first conversation that she'd chosen this neighbourhood because it felt safe and family-friendly. She seemed nice enough, and I was happy to have a neighbour who clearly cared about maintaining her property. About 2 months after Leah moved in, she had a security system installed around her house, motion sensor lights, cameras, and what looked like a pretty comprehensive setup for a residential property. I thought it was smart to invest in security, especially for someone living alone, and I didn't think much about how it might affect the surrounding neighbours. The problem started when Leah had a massive floodlight installed on the side of her house that faces my bedroom window. This wasn't a subtle security light that only activated when needed. This was a commercial-grade floodlight that was bright enough to illuminate a parking lot, and it was positioned directly across from my second-floor bedroom. The light was on a motion sensor, but it was so sensitive that it would activate from cars driving by, cats walking through the yard, or even tree branches moving in the wind. Throughout the night, my bedroom would be flooded with this harsh white light that made it impossible to sleep. It was like having a searchlight pointed directly through my window. I tried using blackout curtains to block the light, but the intensity was so strong that it still leaked around the edges and created this disorienting glow throughout my room. Even with my eyes closed, the sudden brightness when the light activated would wake me up. I started having trouble falling asleep because I was anticipating the next time the light would turn on. After a week of disrupted sleep, I decided to talk to Leah about the situation. I walked over one evening and explained that her new security light was shining directly into my bedroom and making it difficult for me to sleep. I suggested that maybe the light could be repositioned or fitted with a shield to direct the beam away from my window. Leah's response was immediate and defensive. She said her safety was more important than my convenience and that she had every right to install security lighting on her own property. She couldn't understand why I would ask her to compromise her security just because I didn't like having light in my bedroom. I tried to explain that I wasn't asking her to remove the security light, just to modify it so it wouldn't shine directly into my living space. I mentioned that there were shields and directional fittings that could focus the light on her property without affecting the neighbours. She said she'd look into it, but she didn't seem enthusiastic about finding a solution. 2 weeks passed with no changes to the light situation. My sleep continued to be disrupted, and I was starting to feel exhausted and irritable from the constant interruptions. I decided to do some research on local ordinances about light pollution and neighbour disputes to understand what options I might have. It turns out that most municipalities have regulations about lights that create nuisances for neighbouring properties. Excessively bright lights that shine onto adjacent properties can be considered a violation of noise and nuisance ordinances. I printed out the relevant city codes and went back to talk to Leah about finding a solution. When I showed Leah the ordinance information, she became even more defensive. She accused me of trying to intimidate her with legal threats instead of just dealing with a minor inconvenience. She said that anyone who was serious about sleeping could buy better curtains or earplugs, and that expecting her to modify her security system was unreasonable. Our next story comes from someone who learned that generosity can apparently be retroactively claimed by people who didn't contribute a single dollar. My friend told everyone they paid for dinner when I did, so this happened last weekend and I'm still processing it. I organised a dinner with 6 of my closest friends at this nice Italian place downtown to celebrate getting a promotion at work. Nothing too fancy, but definitely a step up from our usual pizza hangouts. Everyone was excited and we had a great table by the window. The whole evening was perfect. We ordered appetizers to share, everyone got their favourite entrees, and we even splurged on dessert and a couple bottles of wine. The conversation was flowing, people were laughing, and it felt like one of those nights you remember forever. When the check came, it was around $300 total, which honestly wasn't surprising given where we were and how much we'd ordered. Rosa immediately started doing that thing where she pats her purse and looks stressed. She said her card was acting up and asked if someone could cover her portion temporarily. She promised to Venmo everyone back the next day. A couple other people mentioned being tight on cash until payday, so I just decided to put the whole thing on my card. I told everyone not to worry about it, and that dinner was my treat, since I was celebrating anyway. Rosa seemed relieved and thanked me multiple times. She said she'd definitely pay me back and kept apologising for the card situation. Everyone else was appreciative too, and the night ended on a really positive note. We all hugged goodbye and made plans to do it again soon. The next morning I woke up to notifications from Instagram and Facebook. Rosa had posted pictures from dinner with captions about how amazing it felt to treat all her friends to a nice meal. She wrote this whole thing about the importance of friendship and how much joy she gets from being generous with the people she cares about. The photos were great, we all looked happy, but the captions made it sound like she had planned and paid for everything. At first I thought maybe she was just being general about the experience and would clarify later, but then more posts appeared throughout the day. She shared stories about choosing the restaurant, making the reservation, and surprising everyone with dinner. She even posted a picture of the receipt, strategically cropped to hide the payment method, with a caption about how worth it the expense was to see everyone smile. Friends who weren't there started commenting about how generous and thoughtful Rosa was. Her family members were praising her in the comments for being such a good friend. People were calling her an inspiration and asking for restaurant recommendations since she clearly had great taste for special occasions. I texted Rosa privately, asking what was going on with the posts. She responded with confusion, saying she was just sharing memories from a fun night out. When I pointed out that the captions made it seem like she had paid, she said she didn't mean it that way, and that people were just misunderstanding. She claimed she was celebrating the experience, not taking credit for paying, but the posts kept coming. Rosa shared the photos to her professional social media accounts with captions about leadership and generosity. She tagged the restaurant, thanking them for helping her create such a special evening for her friends. She even left a detailed review online mentioning how proud she was to bring her favourite people to such a wonderful place. Other friends from our group started texting me, asking if Rosa had really paid for everything. They remembered me putting down my card, but weren't sure if Rosa had reimbursed me or if there had been some arrangement they missed. A couple of them mentioned feeling guilty that Rosa had covered such an expensive meal and wanted to send her money to help offset the cost. I called Rosa and asked her directly to clarify the situation in her posts. She got defensive and said she never explicitly claimed to pay, that people were making assumptions. She argued that she had contributed to the evening by helping choose the restaurant and being part of the planning process. When I reminded her that I had chosen and booked the restaurant, she said she had provided emotional labor and social coordination that were just as valuable as money. The conversation got heated when I asked her to either correct the posts or pay me back the $300 since she was taking credit anyway. Rosa accused me of being petty and materialistic. She said true friends don't keep score and that I was ruining a beautiful memory by focusing on money. She claimed that my reaction showed I hadn't really been generous, that I had given with strings attached. Rosa suggested that since I made more money than her, I should be happy to cover the meal regardless of who got credit. She said successful people are supposed to lift up their friends and that my promotion meant I could afford to be truly generous. She made it sound like asking for accurate representation of who paid was somehow selfish and small-minded. The situation escalated when Rosa posted a vague status about fake friends who give gifts and then try to take them back. She didn't mention names, but the timing was obvious to anyone following the story. People started commenting with support for her, saying real friends don't make generosity conditional and that she deserved better treatment. I decided to comment on one of her original posts with a simple correction. I wrote that while the evening was wonderful and Rosa was great company, I had actually covered the bill and wanted to make sure there wasn't any confusion. Within an hour, Rosa had deleted my comment and blocked me from her social media accounts. Friends from our group started taking sides. Some felt Rosa should acknowledge the truth about payment, while others thought I was being unnecessarily confrontational about something that didn't really matter. The whole friend group dynamic became awkward and strained over what should have been a simple misunderstanding. Rosa never paid me back the $300. She also never corrected her posts or acknowledged that I had covered the meal. Instead, she continued sharing the photos periodically with the same misleading captions. Months later, she was still using the story as an example of her generosity when meeting new people. The most frustrating part was watching Rosa build her reputation as an incredibly generous person based on my money. She started organising more group events, always with the implication that she was this amazingly giving friend who loved treating people. Of course, when the bills came, there were always convenient excuses for why others needed to cover costs temporarily. Our friendship never recovered. The other friends gradually stopped inviting both of us to the same events because the tension was obvious. What should have been a celebration of my promotion became this weird cautionary tale about how quickly someone can rewrite history when it benefits their image. That story is over. Some people really will steal credit for literally anything, including generosity they had absolutely nothing to do with. The fact that she turned it into a whole personal brand while owing the actual generous person $300 is just breathtaking. I hope her fake reputation was worth losing a real friend. Moving on to our next tale. This one's about someone whose cousin apparently thinks fashion is a collaborative effort, where only one person gets to be original. My cousin keeps copying my outfits. This has been going on for about 8 months now, and it's reached the point where I'm actually planning what I wear around family events to avoid the awkwardness. My cousin Elias and I are both in our mid-20s, and we see each other fairly regularly at family gatherings, holidays, and various celebrations. It started at my aunt's birthday party last spring. I put together what I thought was a really unique look. A vintage band t-shirt I'd found at a thrift store, layered under a blazer, with specific jeans, and these boots I'd been saving up for. It was one of those outfits where everything just clicked and I felt really confident and put together. About 3 weeks later, we had a family barbecue. Elias showed up wearing almost the exact same combination. Same style blazer in a nearly identical colour, the same brand of jeans and boots that were clearly chosen to match mine. The only difference was the t-shirt, but even that was a vintage band tee with a similar aesthetic. When people commented on how we looked like we'd coordinated, Elias just laughed and said, "Great minds think alike." At first I thought it was just coincidence. We're close in age, we shop at some of the same places, and maybe we just have similar taste. But then it happened again, and again. Every family event became this weird fashion echo, where Elias would show up wearing a version of whatever I'd worn to the previous gathering. The pattern became unmistakable. If I wore a specific style of jacket to Easter dinner, Elias would have the same jacket at the graduation party 3 weeks later. If I showed up to a wedding in a particular dress with certain accessories, Elias would recreate the look at the next family function. It wasn't just borrowing inspiration, it was almost like she was taking notes and then shopping specifically to match what I'd already worn. What made it more obvious was how deliberate the choices seemed. These weren't basic outfits that anyone might put together independently. I have a pretty distinctive style that involves mixing vintage pieces with modern elements, layering in unexpected ways and choosing accessories that most people wouldn't think to combine. Seeing those same creative choices reproduced with slightly different pieces made it clear this wasn't coincidence. The worst incident was at my grandmother's 80th birthday party. I had planned my outfit for weeks because I knew there would be a lot of photos and I wanted to look special for such an important celebration. I chose this beautiful vintage dress I'd found at an estate sale, paired it with my grandmother's borrowed jewellery, and wore these unique shoes I'd ordered online from a small designer. Elias walked in wearing what was essentially the same outfit. Different vintage dress, but in the same era and style. Similar jewellery that clearly referenced the same aesthetic, and shoes that were obviously chosen to echo mine, even though they were from a different brand. When my grandmother commented on how lovely we both looked and how similar our style was, Elias beamed like she'd put together something original. I started paying attention to Elias's social media after that. She would post photos of her outfits with captions about her personal style and fashion inspiration. She'd share stories about finding unique pieces and developing her aesthetic sense, but I could trace almost every element back to something I'd worn in her presence first. The copying extended beyond just clothing. If I showed up with a new hairstyle, Elias would have the same cut within a month. If I started wearing a particular shade of lipstick or nail polish, those colours would appear in her routine soon after. Even accessories like bags, scarves and jewellery would be replicated with minor variations. What bothered me most wasn't just the copying, but the way Elias presented these choices as her own creative decisions. She'd talk about her fashion sense and personal style as if she'd developed it independently. She'd give advice to other family members about putting outfits together, using techniques and combinations I'd introduced first. I tried addressing it indirectly by asking where she'd gotten certain pieces or what had inspired specific looks. Elias would always have vague answers about seeing things online or in magazines. She'd never acknowledge that we'd just had a conversation about where I'd found similar items or why I'd chosen to style them a particular way. The situation reached peak awkwardness at my cousin's wedding. I had been planning my outfit for months since I was in the wedding party. I'd chosen a dress that complemented the wedding colours while still being distinctive, paired with accessories that were meaningful to me personally. When Elias showed up as a guest wearing essentially the same look, several family members assumed we'd coordinated on purpose. During the reception, people kept commenting on our matching outfits and asking if we'd planned to dress similarly. Elias played into it, saying we must be on the same wavelength and that sisters think alike, even though we're cousins. She seemed to enjoy the attention and the implication that we had some special connection that led to our fashion synchronicity. I finally confronted Elias directly after the wedding. I explained that I'd noticed the pattern of similar outfits and asked if she was intentionally copying my style choices. She got defensive immediately, claiming that she'd never paid attention to what I wore and that any similarities were pure coincidence. She said we just happened to have similar taste and that good style was universal. When I pointed out specific examples of nearly identical outfits appearing after family events, Elias accused me of being possessive and self-centered. She said I didn't own particular styles or combinations and that anyone could wear whatever they wanted. She claimed I was being paranoid and seeing connections that didn't exist. Elias turned the conversation around to make me seem like the problem. She said I was trying to control her self-expression and that my accusations were hurtful and unfair. She mentioned that she'd always admired my style, and maybe that had influenced her subconsciously, but she insisted there was no deliberate copying happening. The confrontation didn't resolve anything. If anything, it made the copying more obvious because now I was actively watching for it. Elias continued showing up to family events in variations of my previous outfits, but now there was this underlying tension because we both knew I was aware of the pattern. Family members started noticing the dynamic too. My mum mentioned that she'd observed the similar outfits and wondered if we were planning looks together. Other relatives would comment on our matching aesthetics and ask if we shopped together or shared clothing. The assumption that we were collaborating made the one-sided copying even more frustrating. I started changing my approach to family events, deliberately choosing simpler outfits or styles that would be harder to replicate. But even then, Elias would find ways to echo elements of what I wore. If I went casual, she'd go casual in a way that referenced my choices. If I dressed up, her version of dressed up would clearly draw from my aesthetic. That story is over. There's something particularly maddening about someone stealing your personal style and then acting like you're crazy for noticing. The confidence to show up wearing someone else's creative choices while claiming it's all coincidence is honestly impressive in the worst possible way. Family gatherings are awkward enough without turning them into unwanted fashion shows. Our third story comes from someone who discovered that their partner has a very creative definition of what constitutes adequate birthday communication. My partner forgot my birthday and then said I didn't remind them enough. This happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm still trying to figure out if I'm overreacting or if this is as ridiculous as it feels. My partner Mira and I have been together for about 1.5 years, so this was our second time celebrating my birthday as a couple. Last year was pretty low-key but thoughtful. Mira remembered the dates without any reminders, planned a nice dinner, and got me a small gift that showed she'd been paying attention to things I'd mentioned wanting. Nothing elaborate, but it felt like she cared enough to put in some effort and make the day feel special. This year, I was looking forward to my birthday more than usual because it fell on a Saturday, so we could actually spend the whole day together without work getting in the way. I had mentioned a few times in the weeks leading up to it that I was excited about having a weekend birthday for once. I didn't make specific plans because I wanted to see what Mira would come up with, and I didn't want to seem demanding. The week of my birthday, I started dropping what I thought were pretty obvious hints. I mentioned that my birthday was coming up during casual conversations. I talked about how my mum had called to discuss birthday dinner plans with my family. I even mentioned that my co-worker had asked what I was doing for my birthday weekend. Nothing too direct, but clear references to the approaching date. My birthday morning arrived, and Mira woke up like it was any other Saturday. She made coffee and started talking about errands she needed to run and chores she wanted to tackle around the apartment. No happy birthday, no acknowledgement of the date. Just normal weekend conversation about mundane tasks. I waited for a while, thinking maybe she was planning to surprise me, or that she was just waiting for the right moment to acknowledge it. But as the morning turned into afternoon, and she continued talking about regular Saturday activities, it became clear that she had completely forgotten what day it was. Around 2 PM, I finally said something. I asked if she knew what day it was, thinking that might jog her memory without me having to explicitly say, "It's my birthday." She looked at her phone, confirmed it was Saturday, and asked if there was something specific she was supposed to remember about this particular Saturday. I had to actually tell my partner of 1.5 years that it was my birthday. The look on her face when I said it was this mix of panic and genuine surprise, like the information was completely new to her. She immediately started apologizing and saying she couldn't believe she'd forgotten, that she was terrible with dates, that she felt awful about it. Mira suggested we could still salvage the day by going out to dinner or doing something special that evening. She offered to take me shopping or to plan something nice for the following weekend instead. She seemed genuinely sorry and embarrassed about forgetting, so I tried to be understanding and not make her feel worse than she already did. But then the excuses started. Over the next few days, Mira began explaining why she'd forgotten in ways that gradually shifted responsibility away from herself. She said I should have reminded her more clearly, since I knew she was bad with dates. She mentioned that I hadn't put my birthday on the calendar we shared, so how was she supposed to remember it? Mira pointed out that I hadn't explicitly told her I was expecting something special for my birthday, so she'd assumed I didn't care about celebrating it. She said that if my birthday was really important to me, I should have been more direct about wanting to do something rather than expecting her to read my mind about my expectations. The conversation that really bothered me happened about a week later when we were discussing weekend plans. Mira mentioned that her friend's birthday was coming up and she needed to remember to get a gift and plan something nice. When I asked how she kept track of her friend's birthday, but had forgotten mine, she said her friend had been better about communicating her birthday expectations. Mira explained that her friend had mentioned her birthday multiple times, had talked about specific things she wanted to do, and had generally made it clear that the date was important to her. She said her friend was good at advocating for herself when it came to celebrations and special occasions. The implication was obvious. According to Mira, the problem wasn't that she'd forgotten my birthday, but that I hadn't done enough to ensure she remembered it. I was supposed to have been more explicit about the date, more clear about my expectations, and more direct about wanting celebration, rather than assuming my partner would remember and care about something as basic as my birthday. When I pointed out that she'd remembered my birthday the previous year without any special reminders or advocacy on my part, Mira said she'd been more focused then because our relationship was newer. She claimed that as couples get more comfortable together, it becomes important to communicate clearly about these things, rather than expecting your partner to just remember everything. Mira also mentioned that she had a lot going on at work and in her personal life, so keeping track of dates wasn't her strong point right now. She suggested that in the future, I should add important dates to our shared calendar and give her plenty of advance notice about anything I wanted to celebrate. The part that really stung was when Mira said that people who care about their birthdays need to take responsibility for making sure others know how to celebrate them appropriately. She made it sound like forgetting someone's birthday was a natural consequence of poor communication on their part, rather than a failure of care or attention. I tried explaining that remembering your partner's birthday isn't about communication skills or calendar management. It's about caring enough about someone to keep track of basic information about their life. I said that having to remind someone to care about your birthday defeats the purpose of celebration entirely. Mira disagreed. She said that in healthy relationships, people communicate their needs clearly rather than expecting their partners to guess what they want. She claimed that my disappointment about the forgotten birthday was really about my failure to set clear expectations and boundaries around celebration. According to her logic, if I wanted my birthday remembered and celebrated, I should have made that explicitly clear well in advance. I should have scheduled the celebration myself, communicated my specific desires, and taken responsibility for ensuring my partner had all the information needed to meet my expectations. The conversation ended with Mira suggesting that we establish better communication protocols for future special occasions. She wanted us to create a shared calendar with all important dates and to discuss celebration expectations in advance, so there wouldn't be any more misunderstandings or disappointments. What bothered me most wasn't just the forgotten birthday, but the way Mira had turned it into a lesson about my communication failures. She'd managed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable for expecting basic consideration without having to explicitly request it. That story's over. The mental gymnastics required to turn forgetting your partner's birthday into a communication failure on their part is truly Olympic-level blame shifting. Apparently, caring about someone enough to remember the day they were born is now considered an unreasonable expectation that requires advance written notice and a detailed celebration plan. Moving on to our next story, this one involves a sibling who apparently thinks superglue is an appropriate solution to covering up accidents. My sibling broke my favourite mug and tried to hide it. This happened about 3 weeks ago, and I'm still finding tiny ceramic pieces around my kitchen. I have this coffee mug that's been with me since college. Nothing fancy to look at, just a plain blue ceramic mug with a small chip on the handle that I got from the campus bookstore. But it's the perfect size, fits perfectly in my hands, and has this sentimental value that's hard to explain to people who don't have that one special cup. My younger brother Jonah was staying with me for a few days while his apartment was getting some plumbing work done. He's generally pretty respectful of my space, but he has this habit of being careless with other people's belongings, not maliciously, just absent-minded in a way that sometimes leads to accidents. I came home from work on Tuesday evening and went straight to the kitchen to make my usual coffee. I reached for my mug in the cabinet, where I always keep it, and something felt immediately wrong when I picked it up. The weight was off, the surface felt different, and there was this weird, rough texture along what should have been smooth ceramic. Looking closer, I could see hairline cracks running all the way around the body of the mug, held together with what was obviously superglue. Someone had broken my mug completely in half and then attempted to repair it by gluing the pieces back together. The glue job was decent enough that from a distance it might look normal, but up close it was clearly damaged goods. The glue had left these raised ridges where the pieces didn't align perfectly, and there were visible gaps filled with dried adhesive. Whoever had done the repair work had tried to be neat about it, but you can't hide that kind of damage completely. The mug was structurally intact enough to hold, but it was obviously compromised and would never be the same. I called out to Jonah asking if he knew anything about what had happened to my coffee mug. There was this long pause before he came into the kitchen, and I could tell from his expression that he knew exactly what I was talking about. He looked at the mug in my hands and then at the floor, clearly trying to figure out what to say. Jonah's first response was to ask what I meant, like maybe I was imagining the obvious damage I was holding in my hands. When I showed him the cracks and glue lines, he admitted that there had been a small accident, but said he'd fixed it and thought it would be fine. He seemed genuinely surprised that I could tell something had happened. He explained that he'd been washing dishes the previous morning and the mug had slipped out of his hands onto the tile floor. It had broken cleanly in 2 pieces, which he thought would make it easy to repair. He'd gone to the hardware store, bought some strong adhesive, and spent time carefully putting it back together. Jonah was proud of his repair job and couldn't understand why I was upset. He pointed out that the mug was still functional, that it could still hold coffee, and that he'd worked hard to make it look as good as possible. From his perspective, he'd solved the problem and I should be grateful for his effort, rather than focusing on the imperfect results. When I explained that the mug had sentimental value and that gluing it back together wasn't the same as it never being broken, Jonah got defensive. He said he'd done his best to fix his mistake and that I was being unreasonable about something that was ultimately just a piece of ceramic. He pointed out that accidents happen, and at least he'd tried to make it right. The part that bothered me most wasn't the original accident, but the fact that Jonah had tried to hide what happened rather than telling me immediately. He'd put the mug back in the cabinet and hoped I wouldn't notice the damage, which felt deceptive, even though his intentions weren't malicious. When I asked why he hadn't just told me about the accident when it happened, Jonah said he'd wanted to fix it first, before admitting there had been a problem. He thought if he could repair it well enough, then there wouldn't be anything to confess. He'd hoped I'd never know the difference, and everyone would be happier that way. Jonah also mentioned that he knew the mug was important to me, which was exactly why he'd wanted to avoid telling me it was broken. He'd seen how much I used it and figured I'd be really upset about the accident. In his mind, attempting a repair and hoping for the best was kinder than immediately delivering bad news. I tried to explain that I would have preferred honesty about the accident. even if it meant being disappointed about the broken mug. At least then I could have decided whether to attempt to repair or just accept that it was time to retire the mug. Having the choice taken away from me and finding out through discovery rather than disclosure felt worse than the original accident. The conversation got tense when Jonah suggested I was overreacting to something that was ultimately replaceable. He said it was just a mug from a college bookstore, that I could probably find an identical one online, and that getting upset about damaged objects wasn't healthy. He made it sound like my attachment to the mug was the real problem. We ended up agreeing that in the future, accidents should be reported immediately rather than hidden and repaired in secret. Jonah apologized for not telling me right away and acknowledged that the cover-up had been a mistake. But he still seemed to think I was being overly emotional about a piece of ceramic. I kept the mug for a few more days, trying to use it normally, but it felt different in my hands, and I kept worrying about the structural integrity. Eventually, I decided to retire it rather than waiting for the repair to fail at an inconvenient moment. The whole experience taught me that some damage can't be undone, no matter how good your intentions are. That story is over. Nothing says I respect your belongings quite like breaking something precious and then playing ceramic surgeon with superglue instead of just owning up to the accident. The confidence to put a Frankenstein mug back on the shelf and hope nobody would notice is honestly kind of impressive. Let's move on to someone whose friend, apparently, thinks movie night is actually date night for everyone involved. My friend invited their date to my movie night without asking. This happened last Friday, and it completely changed the dynamic of what was supposed to be a relaxing evening with close friends. I host a monthly movie night at my apartment for a small group of people I've known for years. It's always the same 4 or 5 of us. We rotate who picks the movie, and it's become this comfortable tradition where we can just be ourselves without any social performance. Ivy has been part of this group since we started doing movie nights about 2 years ago. She knows the whole setup, understands that it's meant to be intimate and low-key, and has always seemed to appreciate having a space where we can just hang out without any pressure or formality. We've talked before about how nice it is to have friends you can be completely comfortable around. Last Friday was my turn to host, and I'd picked this independent film that I'd been wanting to watch with people whose opinions I actually care about. I'd ordered pizza, set up the living room with extra blankets and pillows, and was looking forward to our usual tradition of pausing the movie every 20 minutes to discuss what we thought was happening. Everyone arrived within a few minutes of each other, which is typical for our group. We're all pretty punctual and considerate about timing since we know the routine. But when Ivy showed up, she had someone with her that none of us had ever met before. A guy around our age who she introduced as Alex, someone she'd been seeing for a few weeks. Ivy didn't ask if it was okay to bring Alex, didn't give anyone advance warning, and didn't seem to think there was anything unusual about expanding our small friend group without discussion. She just walked in with him like it was completely normal and started making introductions as if we were all meeting at a casual party rather than an established monthly tradition. Alex seemed nice enough, but he was obviously confused about what kind of gathering this was supposed to be. He dressed up more than the rest of us, brought wine like it was a dinner party, and kept asking questions about the movie selection process that showed he didn't understand the informal nature of our setup. He was trying to be polite and social, but his presence completely changed the energy. The dynamic that makes our movie night special is the fact that we're all completely comfortable with each other. We can make stupid comments during the film, pause to discuss random tangents, and generally behave like the close friends we are, without worrying about making good impressions. With a stranger in the room, everyone became more polite and self-conscious. Instead of our usual running commentary and discussion, people were explaining jokes to Alex and filling him in on references he didn't understand. The natural flow of conversation was disrupted because someone was always having to provide context or background information. What should have been effortless socializing became work. About halfway through the movie, I pulled Ivy aside and asked if we could talk privately for a minute. I explained that I was feeling uncomfortable with the surprise addition to our group, and wondered if she could have given me a heads up before bringing Alex along. I tried to be diplomatic about it and focus on the lack of communication rather than criticizing her choice to bring him. Ivy seemed genuinely shocked that I had a problem with Alex being there. She said she'd thought it would be fine since our movie nights were casual and friendly. She pointed out that Alex was being perfectly polite and wasn't causing any actual problems, so she didn't understand what the issue was. When I tried to explain that the whole point of our movie nights was having a consistent small group where everyone felt completely comfortable, Ivy said that sounded exclusive and unwelcoming. She accused me of being territorial about my apartment and suggested that real friends should be happy to meet new people rather than guarding their social circles. Ivy also mentioned that she was excited about Alex and wanted to share him with her close friends. She said she'd thought we'd all enjoy meeting someone who was important to her, and that bringing him along was a gesture of trust and inclusion. She made it sound like my discomfort was a rejection of her new relationship. The conversation got more heated when I pointed out that she hadn't asked anyone else how they felt about changing the group dynamic for the evening. Ivy said that asking permission to bring someone seemed ridiculous and controlling. She argued that friend groups should be flexible and welcoming rather than rigid about membership and boundaries. According to Ivy, the fact that I was bothered by Alex's presence showed that I was too attached to routine and resistant to change. She suggested that maybe it would be good for our group to expand and evolve, rather than staying stuck in the same patterns. She made it sound like my preference for consistency was actually unhealthy. When we returned to the living room, the awkwardness was obvious to everyone. Alex could tell that there had been some kind of tension and started making comments about not wanting to intrude or cause problems. The other friends were clearly uncomfortable with the conflict, but didn't want to take sides or make things worse. We finished the movie in this weird, strained atmosphere where everyone was being overly polite and careful about their comments. The natural ease that usually characterizes our movie nights was completely gone, replaced by the kind of social performance that our gathering was specifically designed to avoid. After everyone left, Ivy texted me saying she was disappointed in how I'd handled the situation. She said that Alex had felt unwelcome and that my behaviour had been embarrassing for her as his date. She accused me of being possessive about our friend group and suggested that I needed to work on being more inclusive and flexible. That story is over. There's something particularly bold about showing up to someone's established small gathering with an unannounced +1 and then acting shocked when the host isn't thrilled about it. The ability to turn, "Hey, maybe ask first," into "you're being exclusive and territorial" is some serious deflection artistry. Our next story features a cousin who apparently thinks graduations are the perfect backdrop for major life announcements. My cousin took over my graduation party to announce her pregnancy. This happened at my college graduation party last month, and I'm still processing how someone managed to turn my celebration into their personal announcement platform. I'd been planning this party for weeks because graduating college felt like such a huge milestone, especially since I was the first person in my immediate family to get a degree. The party was at my parents' house with about 30 people, mostly family and close friends who had supported me through 4 years of school. My parents had gone all out with decorations, a cake with my name on it, and even a little photo display showing my progression through college. It felt really special to have everyone gathered to celebrate something I'd worked so hard for. My cousin Clara had been enthusiastic about the party from the moment she heard about it. She offered to help with planning, asked if she could contribute anything, and seemed genuinely excited to celebrate my achievement. Clara and I have always been close, so having her support meant a lot to me during what was already an emotional time. The party was going perfectly. People were mingling, sharing college stories, and asking about my plans for the future. I felt like the centre of attention in the best possible way, surrounded by people who cared about me and were proud of what I'd accomplished. My parents looked so happy, and I could tell they were enjoying showing off their graduate daughter. About an hour into the party, I stood up to give a thank you speech. I'd prepared some remarks about how grateful I was for everyone's support during college and how much it meant to have them all there to celebrate with me. I was talking about the people who had helped me get through difficult semesters when Clara suddenly stood up and interrupted me mid-sentence. Clara announced that she had some exciting news to share with everyone while we were all gathered together. Before I could say anything or redirect attention back to the graduation theme, she launched into a detailed announcement about being pregnant with her first child. She had ultrasound photos ready to pass around and started talking about due dates and nursery plans. The energy in the room immediately shifted. Everyone turned toward Clara, congratulating her and asking questions about the pregnancy. The conversation moved completely away from college and graduation toward baby names, parenting advice, and pregnancy experiences. Within minutes, my graduation party had become Clara's pregnancy announcement party. Clara seemed thrilled with the response and kept the focus on herself by continuing to share details about her pregnancy journey. She talked about morning sickness, doctor's appointments, and her plans for maternity leave. She showed photos of potential baby clothes and discussed nursery decoration ideas. The pregnancy became the dominant topic of conversation for the rest of the evening. I stood there holding my abandoned thank you speech, watching my celebration turn into something completely different. People were still polite to me when I joined conversations, but the excitement and focus had clearly shifted to Clara's news. The graduation cake and decorations suddenly felt irrelevant compared to the pregnancy announcement. When I tried to continue my speech after Clara's announcement, it felt awkward and forced. The momentum was gone. People were still thinking about the pregnancy news, and my words about college felt insignificant in comparison. I ended up cutting my remarks short and just thanking everyone for coming. Later that evening, I approached Clara privately and asked why she'd chosen my graduation party to make her pregnancy announcement. She seemed surprised by the question and said she'd thought it would be perfect to share good news at a family celebration. She pointed out that everyone was already gathered together, so it was efficient timing. Clara explained that she'd been excited about the pregnancy and wanted to tell the family as soon as possible. She said my graduation party provided the perfect opportunity to share her news with everyone at once, rather than making individual phone calls or planning a separate gathering. She thought I'd be happy to have double the celebration. When I pointed out that the timing had shifted attention away from my graduation, Clara said that family should be supportive of each other's good news regardless of timing. She suggested that real celebration should be inclusive of everyone's happiness rather than focus solely on one person's achievement. Clara also mentioned that pregnancy announcements are time-sensitive in a way that graduation celebrations aren't. She said she was at the perfect stage to share the news and couldn't wait for another family gathering that might not happen for months. She made it sound like my graduation was less urgent than her pregnancy timeline. The conversation became tense when I suggested that she could have asked me beforehand if it would be okay to share her news at my party. Clara said that asking permission to share good news with family seemed ridiculous and controlling. She accused me of being selfish about attention and suggested that I should be happy for her regardless of timing. According to Clara, the fact that I was bothered by her pregnancy announcement showed that I wasn't truly supportive of her happiness. She said that real family members celebrate each other's milestones without worrying about who gets more attention or whose event it originally was. The aftermath was awkward because other family members were caught between congratulating Clara on her pregnancy and acknowledging my graduation. Some people tried to bring the conversation back to college and my future plans, but the pregnancy remained the dominant topic. My achievement felt diminished in comparison to Clara's life-changing news. That story is over. The timing precision required to interrupt someone's thank you speech at their own graduation party with a pregnancy announcement is honestly impressive. Clara really looked at a celebration specifically planned around someone else's milestone and thought this is the perfect moment to make it about me instead. Moving into our next tale, this one's about a roommate who apparently collects half-finished beverages like they're going out of style. My roommate always leaves half-empty drinks around the house. This has been going on for the entire 8 months we've been living together, and my apartment now looks like a museum of abandoned beverages. My roommate Theo has this habit of opening drinks, taking a few sips and then just leaving them wherever he happens to be when he loses interest. I first noticed the pattern during our second week of living together. I'd find random cans of soda on the coffee table, kitchen counter, and bathroom sink, all with just a few sips missing. At first I thought maybe Theo was saving them for later or planning to come back and finish them, so I'd leave them alone for a day or two before eventually throwing them away. But the pattern never changed. Theo would open a can of Coke, drink maybe a quarter of it, and then abandon it somewhere in the house. He'd grab a bottle of water, take a few gulps, and leave it on his desk where it would sit for days. He'd make coffee in the morning, drink half a cup, and then leave the rest to get cold on the kitchen counter. The variety of abandoned drinks is honestly impressive. Soda cans, water bottles, coffee cups, energy drinks, juice containers, even alcoholic beverages that cost actual money. Theo apparently has no discrimination when it comes to which beverages deserve to be finished and which can be left to go stale around our shared living space. What makes it more frustrating is that these aren't drinks he's forgotten about or lost track of. I've watched him open a fresh soda while there's already a half-empty can sitting 3 feet away from him. He'll grab a new water bottle from the fridge while his previous water bottle sits unfinished on the counter. It's like he has no awareness of his own consumption patterns. The worst locations for abandoned drinks are the places where they create actual problems. Theo leaves coffee cups on the edge of surfaces where they could easily be knocked over. He abandons sticky soda cans on wooden furniture where they leave rings. He puts half-empty water bottles on electronic equipment where condensation could cause damage. I've tried addressing the issue by asking Theo if he's planning to finish specific drinks before I clean them up. He always says yes and that he'll get to them later, but later never comes. Those same drinks will sit in the exact same spots for days until I eventually give up and throw them away myself. The bathroom is particularly bad because Theo apparently likes to bring beverages with him when he's getting ready in the morning, then leaves them on the sink counter where they collect toothpaste splashes and hair product residue. I've found week-old energy drinks covered in a film of bathroom grime that makes them completely disgusting to handle. When I've directly asked Theo why he doesn't finish his drinks, he says he gets distracted or forgets about them once he starts doing other activities. He claims he has good intentions of coming back to finish them, but then gets busy with other things and loses track. He makes it sound like a minor absent-minded habit rather than a persistent household problem. Theo also defends the behaviour by saying he doesn't like to force himself to finish drinks if he's not thirsty anymore. He argues that continuing to drink when you don't want to is wasteful, and that leaving beverages unfinished is actually more in tune with his body's needs than forcing consumption. The financial aspect bothers me too, because Theo is constantly buying new drinks while perfectly good beverages sit unfinished around the house. He'll complain about being broke while simultaneously wasting money on sodas and energy drinks that he only partially consumes. It's like watching someone throw money directly into the trash. I've tried different approaches to solve the problem. I've offered to put abandoned drinks in the fridge so they stay fresh longer. I've suggested that Theo pour smaller portions so there's less waste. I've even bought reusable containers thinking that might encourage him to be more conscious about finishing what he starts. Nothing works. Theo continues to treat beverages like they're unlimited resources that can be opened, partially consumed, and abandoned without any consideration for waste or cleanliness. The house constantly looks like the aftermath of a party where everyone left their drinks scattered around randomly. The most recent incident was last week when I found 7 different abandoned drinks in the living room alone. 3 soda cans, 2 water bottles, a coffee mug, and an energy drink, all in various stages of consumption. Some were recent enough to still be cold, Others had obviously been sitting there for days. When I gathered them all up and showed Theo the collection, he seemed surprised by how many there were. He acknowledged that it looked bad when you saw them all together like that, but then immediately started making excuses about being busy and distracted. He promised to be more aware going forward, but nothing has changed. That story is over. Living with someone who treats every beverage like a free sample at Costco must be absolutely maddening. The fact that Theo can look at 7 abandoned drinks in one room and still think, yeah, I should open another soda, shows a special kind of obliviousness to cause and effect. Our next story comes from someone whose partner apparently thinks relationship comparisons are a form of helpful communication. My partner keeps comparing me to their ex. This started about 6 months into our relationship and has only gotten worse over time. My boyfriend Samir and I have been together for almost 2 years now, and I thought we'd moved past the phase where exes were still relevant topics of conversation. I was wrong. It began with small comments that seemed innocent enough. We'd be cooking dinner together, and Samir would mention that his ex-girlfriend used to make pasta a certain way. Or we'd walk past a restaurant and he'd comment that she really loved that place. At first I tried to be understanding because I know everyone has relationship history, and sometimes comparisons just slip out naturally. But the comments became more frequent and more specific. When I'd suggest activities for the weekend, Samir would mention whether his ex had enjoyed similar things. When I'd cook something new, he'd compare it to how she used to prepare the same dish. When I'd wear certain outfits, he'd make observations about her style preferences that seemed to relate to my choices. The comparisons weren't always negative, which somehow made them more confusing. Sometimes Sammy would say I did something better than she had, or that I was more thoughtful about certain things. But even positive comparisons felt weird because they meant he was constantly evaluating my behaviour against someone else's, rather than appreciating what I brought to the relationship independently. What bothered me most was how automatic these comparisons seemed to be. Samir wasn't making deliberate statements about his ex. He was just thinking out loud in ways that revealed how much mental space she still occupied. Every experience we shared seemed to trigger some memory or comparison related to his previous relationship. I started paying attention to when the comparisons happened most often. They were especially frequent during activities that couples typically do together, like cooking, watching movies, or planning trips. It was like Samir had this blueprint of relationship experiences based on his past, and he was constantly measuring our relationship against that template. The worst incident happened when we were planning a weekend getaway for my birthday. I'd found this charming bed and breakfast about 2 hours away and was excited about having a romantic trip together. When I showed Sammy the website, his first response was that it looked similar to a place he'd stayed with his ex, and that she would have loved the vintage decor. He went on to explain that his ex was really into antique furniture and historic buildings, so this type of accommodation would have been perfect for her interests. He mentioned specific things she would have appreciated about the property, and even suggested that we might enjoy some of the same activities she would have chosen. I pointed out that this was supposed to be about what I would enjoy for my birthday, not about whether his ex would have approved of my choices. Samir seemed surprised by my reaction and said he was just making conversation, that he hadn't meant anything negative by the comparison. He claimed he was actually trying to be supportive by drawing on his experience. When I explained that constantly hearing about his ex made me feel like I was competing with someone who wasn't even present, Samir said I was being oversensitive. He argued that everyone has relationship history and that comparing experiences is natural human behaviour. He made it sound like my discomfort was unreasonable rather than acknowledging the impact of his words. Samir also defended the comparisons by saying they helped him appreciate what was good about our relationship. He claimed that having a point of reference made him more grateful for the positive aspects of being with me. According to his logic, the comparisons were actually beneficial because they highlighted why our relationship was better. I tried explaining that I didn't want to be evaluated against anyone else, that I wanted our relationship to exist on its own terms rather than in comparison to his past. Samir said that was impossible because everyone brings their history into new relationships. He acted like I was asking him to pretend his ex had never existed. The conversation got heated when I suggested that maybe he wasn't ready for a new relationship if he was still so focused on his previous one. Samir accused me of being jealous and insecure, saying that confident people don't feel threatened by their partner's past relationships. He turned my legitimate concern into a character flaw on my part. What made it worse was that Samir seemed completely unaware of how often he made these comparisons. When I started pointing them out in real time, he was genuinely surprised by the frequency. He claimed he hadn't realized he was doing it so much, but even with increased awareness, the behavior continued. The comparisons extended beyond just activities and preferences to personality traits and relationship dynamics. Samir would comment on how I handled conflict differently than his ex, or how my communication style contrasted with hers. Even when the comparisons were favorable to me, they reinforced the sense that I was constantly being measured against someone else. I started feeling like I could never just be myself in the relationship because everything I did was being filtered through this lens of comparison. Instead of experiencing things naturally with Samir, I was always wondering how his ex would have handled the same situation and whether I was measuring up to whatever standard she had set. The final straw came when we were having dinner with some of his friends who had known his ex. Throughout the evening, Samir kept making comments about how different I was from her, pointing out contrasts in our personalities and interests. His friends looked uncomfortable, and I felt like I was being presented as the replacement model rather than as someone valuable in my own right. After that dinner, I told Samir that the constant comparisons needed to stop or our relationship wasn't going to work. He agreed to be more conscious about it, but said that completely eliminating references to past relationships was unrealistic. He wanted credit for trying to be more aware without making any real commitment to change. That story is over. There's something particularly exhausting about dating someone who treats their ex like the gold standard for everything relationship-related. The fact that Samir turned legitimate concerns into accusations of insecurity shows exactly why he's probably going to keep cycling through relationships until he figures out that comparing partners is not the romantic strategy he thinks it is. Moving on to our next tale, this one involves a friend who is apparently confused borrowing with permanent acquisition. My friend always borrows my charger and never gives it back. This has been happening for about 8 months now, and I've basically become an involuntary electronics supplier for someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own device management. My friend Juliet has this pattern of asking to borrow my phone charger and then somehow never getting around to returning it. It started during finals week last semester when Juliet's phone died during a study session at the library. She asked if she could borrow my charger cable, promising to return it the next day when we met for coffee. I handed it over without thinking twice because that's what friends do. They help each other out during stressful times. The next day came and went without any mention of my charger. When I texted Juliet asking about it, she said she'd left it at her apartment and would bring it to our next class, but when I saw her in class, she'd forgotten to bring it again. This pattern continued for about 2 weeks before I finally just bought a replacement charger so my phone wouldn't die. A month later, Juliet asked to borrow my new charger during a group project meeting. She said hers was broken and she really needed to keep her phone charged for important calls from her internship supervisor. Again, I let her borrow it, figuring she'd learned from the previous experience and would be more responsible about returning it promptly. That charger disappeared into the same black hole as the first one. Juliet would promise to bring it back, then forget, then promise again, then make excuses about leaving it in her car or her dorm room or wherever else seemed convenient at the moment. After a few weeks of this routine, I gave up asking and bought another replacement. The pattern has repeated itself 4 times now. Juliet borrows my charger, keeps it indefinitely, and I eventually have to replace it because waiting for her to return it is pointless. She's currently had my main charger for over a month, and every time I ask about it, she has some excuse for why she doesn't have it with her at that moment. What makes this especially frustrating is that Juliet clearly has the money to buy her own chargers. She regularly purchases expensive coffee, new clothes, and other non-essential items. But somehow when it comes to basic phone accessories, she's always borrowing from other people instead of taking responsibility for her own needs. I've tried different approaches to solve this problem. I've offered to go shopping with Juliet to help her pick out her own charger. I've sent her links to affordable charging cables online. I've even offered to buy her a charger as an early birthday gift just to stop the cycle of borrowing and never returning. Juliet always says that's unnecessary because she has chargers, they just break frequently or get lost. She claims she's planning to buy a really good quality one soon, so there's no point in getting a temporary solution. But soon never comes, and she continues relying on borrowed chargers from friends. The most recent incident was last week when Juliet asked to borrow my backup charger because hers was acting weird and only working intermittently. She promised she'd only need it for a couple of days until she could get hers fixed or buy a replacement. That backup charger is now missing in action, along with all the others. When I pointed out that she currently has 2 of my chargers and hasn't returned either one, Juliet acted surprised and said she didn't realise she had so many. She claimed she'd mixed them up with her own chargers and would sort through her collection to figure out which ones were mine. That was a week ago, and I haven't heard anything since. I've started hiding my chargers when I know Juliet is coming over, which feels ridiculous but seems to be the only way to ensure I can actually charge my own phone. I keep one charger in my room and another in my car, both out of sight, so she can't ask to borrow them during moments of desperation. The situation reached peak absurdity when Juliet complained to our mutual friends about how her phone was always dying because she could never find a working charger. She presented it as this ongoing technical problem she was dealing with, rather than acknowledging that she borrows chargers from people and then never returns them. One of our friends even offered to let Juliet borrow their charger after hearing about her struggles. I had to interrupt and explain that Juliet already had multiple borrowed chargers, including several of mine, and that lending her more equipment wouldn't solve the underlying problem of her never returning anything. Juliet got defensive and said I was making her sound irresponsible in front of our friends. She claimed that keeping track of borrowed items was harder than I was making it seem, and that everyone loses track of small electronics sometimes. She made it sound like I was being unreasonable for expecting basic accountability. When I suggested that maybe Juliet should buy her own chargers instead of constantly borrowing from friends, she said that seemed wasteful since so many people had extras. She argued that sharing resources was more environmentally friendly than everyone buying individual chargers they might not always need. That story is over. Juliet has somehow turned chronic charger theft into an environmental initiative while maintaining a straight face. The fact that she can complain about not having working chargers while actively hoarding multiple borrowed ones shows a level of cognitive dissonance that's almost artistic in its completeness. Let's move on to someone whose sibling apparently thinks shared streaming accounts work on a finders keepers basis. My sibling used my streaming account and changed the password. This happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm still locked out of services that I pay for monthly. My younger brother Luca has been using my Netflix, Hulu, and Disney Plus accounts for about a year now, which I was fine with since I figured it was a nice way to help him save money while he was in college. The arrangement worked well initially. Luca would watch his shows, I'd watch mine, and we'd occasionally text each other recommendations about series we thought the other person would enjoy. I never had any issues with him using the accounts, and he seemed grateful to have access to streaming services without the financial burden. About 6 months ago, I noticed that some of my viewing preferences had been disrupted. Shows I'd been watching would disappear from my continue watching list, replaced by series I'd never seen before. My algorithm recommendations shifted toward content I had no interest in, clearly influenced by whatever Luca was binge-watching during his free time. When I mentioned this to Luca, he apologized and said he'd try to be more careful about not interfering with my viewing experience. He suggested we could create separate user profiles so our preferences wouldn't get mixed up. I thought that was a reasonable solution and helped him set up his own profiles on each platform. The profile system worked for a while, but then I started getting notifications about unusual login activity on my accounts. The streaming services were detecting logins from locations I'd never been to, at times when I wasn't using the accounts. When I asked Luca about it, he admitted he'd shared the login information with a couple of his friends at school. I wasn't thrilled about random people using accounts I was paying for, but I didn't want to make a huge issue out of it. I asked Luca to limit sharing to just 1 or 2 close friends, and to make sure they understood these were borrowed accounts that should be used respectfully. He agreed an account and discovered that my password no longer worked. I assumed promised to be more selective about who had access. 2 weeks ago, I tried to log into my Netflix. There had been some kind of security issue, or that I'd misremembered my login information. I went through the password reset process and tried to regain access to my account. The password reset email revealed that someone had recently changed not just my password, but also the email address associated with the account. My account was no longer connected to my email, which meant I couldn't regain access through normal recovery methods. Someone had essentially hijacked my account and locked me out of my own streaming service. I called Netflix customer service and explained the situation. After verifying my identity through billing information and account history, they confirmed that the account had been transferred to a different email address. The representative was able to restore my access, but warned me to secure my account better to prevent future unauthorized changes. I immediately called Luca to ask if he knew anything about the password change. There was a long pause before he admitted that one of his friends had suggested changing the password to prevent other people from using the account. According to Luca, his friend thought there were too many people with access and that securing the account would improve streaming quality. When I pointed out that changing the password had locked me out of my own account, Luca said that it had been an accident. He claimed his friend didn't realize that changing the password would affect my access, and that they'd been planning to give me the new login information once they figured out how to contact me. The explanation didn't make sense because Luca had my phone number and could have reached out immediately if there had been a genuine mistake. When I asked why he hadn't called or texted about the password change, he said he'd been meaning to, but had gotten busy with schoolwork and forgotten. I told Luca that I was changing all the passwords and that he and his friends would no longer have access to my streaming accounts. He seemed shocked and said that seemed like an extreme reaction to what he called a simple misunderstanding. He argued that cutting off access would hurt his friends, who had been relying on the accounts for entertainment. Luca offered to pay me back for a portion of the monthly subscription fees if I would restore his access. He said he understood that I was upset about the password situation, but that completely removing his access was unfair punishment for his friend's mistake. He made it sound like I was being vindictive rather than protecting my own accounts. When I refused to restore his access, Luca got defensive and said I was being selfish about something that cost me the same amount, whether other people used it or not. He argued that streaming accounts were meant to be shared and that cutting off family members over password issues was petty and mean-spirited. The conversation got heated when Luca suggested that I should be happy to help support his education by providing entertainment options that helped him relax during stressful school periods. He made it sound like access to my streaming accounts was something I owed him as his older sibling, rather than a favour I'd been doing out of generosity. I explained that the issue wasn't about sharing accounts, but about respect and communication. If someone was going to change passwords on accounts I was paying for, they needed to discuss it with me first, rather than just taking control and hoping I wouldn't notice. Luca said that seemed like micromanaging, and that I was making streaming accounts more complicated than they needed to be. That story is over. The audacity of hijacking someone's streaming account and then acting shocked when they change the passwords back is truly something special. Luca really thought my friend locked you out of your own account for security reasons was going to be an acceptable explanation for what theft. Our Amounts to Digital next story features a friend who apparently thinks comedy is a collaborative art form where only one person gets to take credit. My friend takes credit for jokes I make. This has been happening for about 6 months now, and I'm starting to feel like I'm providing free material for someone else's comedy career. My friend Jonas and I have similar senses of humour and often bounce jokes off each other during group conversations. But lately, he's been presenting my material as his own original content. It started during casual conversations with mutual friends. I'd make a joke that would get a good laugh from the group, and then later Jonas would repeat the exact same joke in different company, presenting it as something he'd come up with spontaneously. At first, I thought maybe he'd forgotten where the joke came from, but the pattern became too consistent to be accidental. The most obvious example happened during a group chat conversation about bad dating experiences. I made a comment about how online dating profiles should come with warning labels like cigarette packages, complete with specific examples of what those warnings might say. Everyone thought it was hilarious, and the conversation took off from there. 3 days later, Jonas posted almost the exact same joke on his social media, using my specific examples and even expanding on the concept in ways that built directly on the conversation we'd all had. When people commented about how funny and original his post was, Jonas responded as if he'd come up with the entire concept himself. I screenshot the original group chat conversation and compared it to Jonas's post. The similarities were undeniable, not just in the basic premise, but in the specific wording and examples used. This wasn't a case of similar minds thinking alike, it was direct appropriation of material I'd created during our group conversation. When I confronted Jonas about it privately, he claimed that jokes made during casual conversations were fair game for everyone to use. He said that comedy builds on shared ideas and that trying to claim ownership of spontaneous humour was unrealistic and petty. He made it sound like I was being possessive about something that naturally belonged to everyone present. Jonas also argued that he'd improved on my original joke by expanding it and posting it in a format that reached more people. He suggested that I should be flattered that he thought my humour was good enough to share more widely, rather than being upset about not getting credit for the original concept. The behaviour escalated when Jonas started taking my jokes from group conversations and using them in his stand-up comedy performances at local open mic nights. I'd recognise my own material being delivered on stage, sometimes word for word, sometimes with minor modifications that didn't change the essential structure or punchline I'd created. After one particularly obvious example where Jonas used an entire bit I'd improvised during a dinner conversation, I asked him directly to stop using my material without permission. He got defensive and said that all comedy was collaborative, that comedians borrowed from each other constantly, and that I was being unreasonably territorial about casual jokes. Jonas claimed that the jokes were funnier when he told them because he had better timing and delivery than I did. He suggested that I should be grateful he was giving my material a proper presentation rather than letting it die in private conversations. He made it sound like he was doing me a favour by stealing my jokes. When I pointed out that professional comedians don't typically steal material from their friends without credit, Jonas said that comparing casual conversation to professional comedy was ridiculous. He argued that jokes made during social interactions weren't intellectual property and that anyone present had equal rights to use that material later. The situation became more frustrating when other friends started complimenting Jonas on his sense of humour, using examples that were actually jokes I'd made originally. I'd watch people praise his comedic timing and creativity while looking at material I'd created, but I couldn't correct them without seeming petty or creating awkward social dynamics. Jonas began actively mining our group conversations for material, sometimes asking follow-up questions about jokes I'd made that seemed designed to get me to elaborate so he'd have more content to work with. What had once felt like natural comedic collaboration started feeling like I was being used as an unpaid writing staff. The final straw was when Jonas posted a video online using a joke format I'd created, complete with the specific structure and examples I developed during a conversation about workplace absurdities. The video got thousands of views and dozens of comments praising Jonas for his clever and original humour. When I asked Jonas why he hadn't credited me as the source of the joke format, he said that crediting people for casual conversation contributions would be impractical and weird. He argued that social media posts weren't academic papers and that expecting citations for humour was unreasonable and antisocial. That story is over. Jonas has essentially turned friendship into an unpaid internship where he gets all the credit and recognition while his friends provide the actual creative content. The fact that he's performing stolen material at open mics while acting like casual conversation jokes, a community property, shows a level of shamelessness that's almost impressive. Moving on to our next story. This one involves a mother who apparently thinks interior design is a team sport, where only one person gets to make decisions. My mum keeps rearranging my room when I'm not home. This has been happening for the past 4 months since I moved back home after college, and I can never find anything in what's supposed to be my own personal space. My mother Iris has always been particular about household organisation, but she's taken that tendency to an extreme level with my bedroom. I moved back home temporarily while I look for a job and save money for my own apartment. The arrangement was supposed to be short-term and mutually beneficial. I'd have a place to stay while getting established, and my parents would have help around the house and some companionship. I was grateful for their support during this transition period. My childhood bedroom had been converted into a guest room, an office space, during the years I was away at college. When I moved back, we cleared out most of the office supplies and guest furniture to make room for my stuff. I arranged my clothes, books, and personal belongings in a way that made sense to me and felt comfortable. The first time I noticed something was different. I couldn't find my laptop charger where I'd left it on my desk. After searching for 20 minutes, I found it neatly coiled in a drawer that I never would have thought to check. When I asked Iris about it, she said she'd been tidying up and thought the charger looked messy sitting on the desktop. Over the following weeks, more of my belongings started migrating to locations I hadn't chosen. Books I was currently reading would disappear from my nightstand and reappear on shelves across the room. Clothes I'd laid out for the next day would be hung in the closet or folded in drawers. Personal items would be relocated to what Iris considered more appropriate storage locations. The rearranging wasn't random or destructive. It was systematic and based on Iris's ideas about proper organisation. She had specific opinions about where different types of items should be stored and would reorganise my space according to those principles whenever I was out of the house for more than a few hours. When I tried to explain that I preferred to organise my own space, Iris said she was just trying to help me maintain a clean and organised environment. She pointed out that I'd been living in dorm rooms and apartments for years and might have developed bad habits about clutter and organisation that she was helping me correct. Iris also mentioned that since I was living in her house rent-free, keeping shared spaces tidy was part of my responsibility as a family member. When I pointed out that my bedroom wasn't really a shared space, she said that all areas of her house reflected on her as a homeowner and that messy rooms made the entire house feel disorganised. The situation escalated when I started finding personal items in completely different rooms. My phone charger would be in the kitchen drawer with other electronics. My books would be shelved in the living room with the family library. My clothes would be integrated with linens in the hall closet because Iris thought that was a more efficient use of storage space. Every time I'd track down a missing item and return it to my room, it would migrate again within days. I felt like I was playing a constant game of hide and seek with my own belongings, never knowing where Iris had decided they should live, based on her organisational system. I tried having a direct conversation with Iris about boundaries and personal space. I explained that even though I was grateful to be living at home, I needed to have some control over my immediate environment. I asked her to stop rearranging my belongings without asking me first. Iris responded that she wasn't rearranging anything. She was organising and cleaning, which was different. She said that leaving items scattered around rooms was creating unnecessary work for her when she tried to maintain the house. According to her logic, putting things in proper places wasn't rearranging, it was basic housekeeping. When I suggested that maybe we could establish some areas that were off limits to her organisational efforts, Iris said that would make cleaning the house more complicated and inefficient. She argued that having different organisational systems in different rooms created confusion and made it harder to maintain overall household order. The final confrontation happened when I came home to find that Iris had completely reorganised my closet according to a colour coding system that made no sense to me. My work clothes were mixed with casual clothes, and items I wore frequently were stored in hard-to-reach places, while things I never wore were at eye level. When I asked Iris why she'd reorganised my entire closet without permission, she said she'd been trying to maximise storage efficiency and create a more visually appealing arrangement. She seemed proud of the work she'd done and couldn't understand why I wasn't grateful for her effort and expertise. I explained that even if her organisational system was objectively better, I needed to be consulted before major changes were made to my personal space. My personal space. Iris said that consulting me about every small organisational improvement would make housekeeping impossibly complicated, and that I should trust her experience with home management. The conversation became tense when I pointed out that I was an adult who should have some say in how my living space was arranged. Iris responded that adults living in their parents' homes needed to respect house rules and standards, and that expecting special treatment just because I was her child was unrealistic and entitled. She also mentioned that my temporary living situation meant adapting to established household systems rather than creating individual exceptions that would disrupt the overall organisation. According to Iris, learning to live according to someone else's standards was actually good preparation for future roommate situations. That story is over. Iris has managed to turn basic respect for personal belongings into a masterclass on home organisation theory, while completely missing the point that some people like to know where their own stuff is. The ability to frame systematic boundary violations as helpful life lessons is honestly a special kind of parental overreach. Our next tale comes from someone whose friend apparently thinks food sharing works on a grab first, ask later basis. My friend took a bite out of my food before I even sat down. This happened last week at a group lunch, and I'm still processing the casual audacity of someone treating my meal like a communal appetizer. My friend Ethan and I were meeting up with a few other people at this casual restaurant downtown, the kind of place where you order at the counter and find your own table. I'd been looking forward to trying their signature sandwich that everyone had been recommending. After waiting in line for about 10 minutes, I finally got my food and was carrying my tray toward the table where everyone was sitting. I could see that most of our group had already received their orders and were settling in to eat. As I approached the table, Ethan looked up from his own meal and noticed what I'd ordered. Before I could even set my tray down or pull out my chair, he reached over and took a substantial bite from my sandwich. Not a small taste or a corner piece, but a legitimate bite that removed probably an eighth of the sandwich. I stood there holding my tray, watching Ethan chew my food while nodding approvingly about the flavour combination. He made some comment about how good it looked and how he'd been curious about that particular sandwich. Then he casually said, "You don't mind, right?" Oi, while I was still processing what had just happened. The timing was what made it so jarring. I hadn't even sat down yet, let alone had a chance to look at my food or take my first bite. Ethan had essentially intercepted my meal during the brief moment when I was transitioning from standing with the tray to sitting at the table. It felt like a drive-by food theft. When I asked why he'd taken a bite before I'd even had a chance to try my own sandwich, Ethan seemed confused by the question. He said he'd just wanted to taste it and figured I wouldn't care about sharing food between friends. He made it sound like I was being weird about a normal social interaction. I explained that while I didn't mind sharing food in general, I would have appreciated being asked first, especially since I hadn't even had a chance to see what my sandwich looked like intact. Ethan laughed and said that asking permission for a small bite would have been unnecessarily formal between friends. The other people at our table were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but didn't want to get involved in what seemed like a minor disagreement about food etiquette. Someone made a joke about Ethan being a food thief, and the conversation moved on to other topics, but I spent the rest of lunch feeling oddly violated about the whole interaction. What bothered me most wasn't the actual food sharing, but the assumption that my consent was irrelevant to the decision. Ethan had looked at my food, decided he wanted to try it, and taken a bite without any consideration for whether I was okay with that level of casual appropriation of my meal. The incident felt especially weird because Ethan had ordered his own food and wasn't lacking options. This wasn't a case of someone being hungry and needing to share resources. He had a full meal sitting in front of him, but apparently couldn't resist sampling what other people had chosen instead. After lunch, I mentioned the incident to another friend who wasn't there, trying to figure out if I was overreacting to what might be normal behaviour. She was shocked and said that taking someone's food before they'd even sat down crossed a line that most people would recognise as inappropriate. The validation helped me realise that my discomfort was justified. There's something fundamentally different between offering to share food and having it taken without permission, especially when the taking happens before you've had any chance to enjoy what you ordered for yourself. When I saw Ethan again the following week, he seemed to have completely forgotten about the sandwich incident. He acted normally and didn't reference what had happened or acknowledge that his behaviour might have been problematic. It was like the whole interaction had been so unremarkable to him that it didn't register as worth remembering. I decided to test whether this was a pattern by paying attention to Ethan's behaviour around food in group settings. Sure enough, he had a habit of sampling other people's orders, usually without asking first. He'd reach for fries, take sips of drinks, and generally treat group dining as an opportunity for communal tasting. The pattern made me realise that Ethan probably didn't see anything unusual about taking a bite of my sandwich, because that's how he approached food in social situations generally. But understanding his perspective didn't make me feel any less annoyed about having my meal appropriated before I could even look at it properly. That story is over. Ethan really looked at someone carrying a tray to their table and thought, perfect timing for unauthorized food sampling. Kuwap. The confidence required to take a bite out of someone's untouched meal and then act like asking permission would have been unnecessarily formal is truly breathtaking. Moving on to our next story, this one involves a cousin who apparently thinks embarrassing childhood stories are the perfect icebreaker for every social situation. My cousin keeps bringing up embarrassing childhood stories. This has been happening at every family gathering and social event for the past 2 years, and I'm starting to dread introducing Hugo to new people because I know exactly what's coming. My cousin Hugo and I grew up together, so he has access to a comprehensive library of my most mortifying childhood moments. The stories themselves aren't that terrible in isolation. Just typical kid stuff like the time I got scared during a movie and hid under the theatre seats, or when I insisted on wearing a superhero costume to a fancy restaurant when I was 7. Normal childhood behaviour that most people would forget, or at least have the courtesy not to broadcast to strangers. But Hugo has turned these stories into his signature social material. Whenever we're at parties, family events, or casual gatherings where I'm meeting new people, Hugo inevitably launches into detailed narratives about my childhood mishaps. He presents them as hilarious anecdotes that everyone simply must hear. The worst part is his timing. Hugo seems to have a sixth sense for moments when I'm trying to make a good first impression or establish credibility with new people. Just when conversations are going well and I'm feeling confident about how I'm coming across, Hugo appears with a story designed to undercut whatever mature adult image I've been building. Last month at a work party, I was talking with some colleagues about a challenging project I'd been managing. The conversation was professional, and I felt like I was demonstrating competence and leadership skills. Then Hugo walked over and immediately launched into the story about how I used to be afraid of automatic toilets and would make adults come into public bathrooms with me. The story itself might have been funny in the right context, but dropping it into the middle of a professional conversation completely derailed the serious tone I'd been trying to establish. My colleagues didn't know how to respond to this random childhood anecdote, and the whole interaction became awkward and uncomfortable. I've asked Hugo directly to stop telling these stories, especially in professional or dating contexts where they might affect how people perceive me. He always responds that the stories are harmless fun and that anyone who judges me based on childhood behaviour isn't worth knowing anyway. He makes it sound like I'm being overly sensitive about innocent entertainment. Hugo also argues that these stories are part of our family history and shared experiences that help explain who we are as people. He claims that sanitizing our past or pretending childhood moments didn't happen is dishonest, and that real relationships should include knowledge of someone's complete background. When I point out that I have equally embarrassing stories about Hugo that I choose not to share publicly, he says that wouldn't bother him, and that I'm welcome to tell any stories about his childhood that I think are amusing. He seems genuinely confused about why I find his storytelling problematic. The issue isn't just the content of the stories, but the way Hugo tells them. He has this theatrical delivery style that maximizes the embarrassing impact, complete with sound effects and detailed descriptions that paint vivid pictures of my childhood mortification. He clearly enjoys being the center of attention during these performances. Hugo's storytelling has started affecting how I interact in social situations. I find myself trying to control his access to conversations, steering him away from people I want to maintain professional relationships with, and generally feeling anxious whenever he's present at events where I'm meeting new people. That's all for tonight's collection of stories that make you question whether some people were raised by wolves or just skipped every lesson on basic human decency. Whether you're still building that castle in Minecraft, cramming for exams, or just trying to fall asleep to the sound of other people's drama, I hope these tales reminded you to appreciate the simple joy of friends who actually return your stuff, family members who don't steal your spotlight, and partners who remember that you exist without needing written reminders. Sweet dreams, and remember, at least your problems probably aren't this ridiculous.